Hey guys, tonight we step into the fog of a frost-bitten morning on the edge of a windswept fjord. Smoke curls through the rafters of a timber longhouse as you roll off a straw-stuffed mattress, your limbs stiff from another night wrapped in wool and cold air. Outside, snowflakes drift lazily to the ground, but in here it's the scent of damp earth wood smoke and something porridge-like that draws your attention. There's a pot hanging above the fire bubbling with thick barley gruel. A wooden ladle clinks against the pot's rim as an older woman stirs it slowly, muttering about not burning the bottom again. You shuffle closer, still groggy, clutching a carved wooden bowl with hands that remember yesterday's rowing. Your breakfast awaits creamy steaming and may be sweetened with a touch of goat milk and wildflower honey if you're lucky. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit by the hearth and spoon the hot, sticky porridge into your mouth. It's not bad. Warm nutty, a little sour if the grain's been sitting too long. This is no Viking banquet, you're just a farmer, a warrior, maybe someone useful. And in this little village, usefulness gets you a bowl of barley in the morning. Sometimes oat, sometimes rye. Always thick, always filling. You can thank the Norse stomach gods for that. You glance at the others squatting on fur mats nearby. One man sprinkles salt from a carved horn. Another uses a wooden spoon carved with a serpent's head. Someone's lucky enough to have apples dried and wrinkled but sweet. You chew slowly the fire warming your face and listen to the muffled rustle of reindeer hides as people shift, stretch, wake. Despite what most people imagine, no Vikings didn't just eat meat and guzzle ale for every meal. Sure, they had their feasting moments, but on most days meals were simple, practical, and heavily reliant on whatever grains the climate allowed. Barley was the hero crop, the underdog of the Norse pantry. It resisted, cold-stored well, and filled you up. That made it the backbone of nearly every meal from gruel to bread to the beer you'd sip later. Historians still argue whether barley was mainly a peasant food, or if even high-status Norsemen slurped it every day like everyone else. But judging by the volume of charred barley crust found in ancient pots, chances are everyone was in the barley club, nobles, warriors, and even the occasional saga hero. You scrape your bowl and run your tongue across your teeth. Gritty. Must have been a bit of sand in the meal again. Querns, those hand-cranked grindstones, weren't exactly precise tools. You can practically feel the enamel wearing down with each bite. That's the price of breakfast in the Viking Age mild dental erosion. A child runs past with a scrap of cheese and a fistful of dried berries, squealing as his sister chases him with a stick. The cheese is probably goat sharp crumbly with a distinct tang that lingers on the tongue like a grudge. And the berries gathered last summer, dried on flat stones and stored in cloth sacks. Lingon berries, maybe. Cloudberries, if you're lucky. Sweet and tart, they brighten up an otherwise beige culinary landscape. Your stomach's no longer empty, and the warmth has seeped into your limbs. Time to head out. You wrap yourself in a cloak and push aside the longhouse's heavy door. The cold bites instantly. The ground crunches underfoot as you trudge toward the shoreline. Someone's already calling out about herring, but back to the longhouse. Let's linger a bit longer. This isn't a grand hall of mead and minstrels. It's a communal home shared by several families and, oh yes, the livestock. A pair of sheep huddle in a corner bleating softly. Their breath rises like mist. You give them a nod. They give you nothing in return. The fire is the heart of this place, always burning, always smoky. Everything smells faintly of it. Your clothes, your hair, your food, even your dreams. You once dreamt of a roasted lamb turning on a spit, only to wake up chewing on your own hair. Not your finest moment. In one corner, someone's kneading dough. She presses her thumb into the center, adds a sprinkle of crushed juniper, and sets it aside. That's for tonight. Flatbread, dense and nutty, baked on hot stones, or in a clay oven if you're fancy. There's no yeast, no rise, just flour water and heat. Simple, efficient. Like you duck outside again, feeling the wind whip your face like a disapproving elder. You hear gulls, the crunch of snow, and the unmistakable splash of a net hitting the water. Someone's already at the fjord, pulling fish from the icy depths. It's not your turn yet. Instead, you stomp toward the grain shed to check on the stores. Inside, the air is cool and dry. Burlap sacks hold barley rye and the occasional oat. Some are speckled with mouse droppings. You shoo one away. Rodents are the real raiders out here. You scoop a handful of barley and let it sift through your fingers. There's enough for a few more weeks if no one gets greedy. You rub your belly and chuckle. If Odin wanted us full, someone once said he'd have invented sausages that grow on trees, but no divine bratwurst appears. Just grain again and again. Maybe that's the secret behind Viking endurance relentless, reliable fuel. No frills, no flavors, just sustenance. There are stories, of course, whispered tales of Viking travelers in the east, bringing back strange spices and golden grains of flatbreads, so soft they fold of wine so sweet it makes you weep. But here, you get porridge. Still, you can't complain too much. You've had worse. Remember the time a neighbor tried to make soup from moss and boiled squirrel bones? That was a culinary war crime. And yet you survived. One man once tried adding seawater to his porridge to save on salt. He didn't survive. Not because of the porridge, but because someone shoved him off the dock after he suggested it a second time. You sip a bit of sour milk, cold and thick. Not quite skyr, not quite yogurt, just tangy. Probably better on bread. But you gulp it anyway, wiping your mouth with your sleeve like a true Viking. You pack a few dried apples in your satchel, along with some of yesterday's bread, now stiff enough to double as a weapon. You never know when a snack might come in handy, especially when fish duty looms. So you head toward the fjord, your belly full, your cloak flapping in the wind, and your thoughts already drifting to lunch. Hopefully, fish. Maybe smoked, maybe not. But certainly not moss again. Not today. The wind nips at your cheeks as you make your way to the water's edge. The ground icy and uneven beneath your boots. The sea stretches out before you in a jagged, frozen sigh gray, vast and gently steaming at the edges where it meets warmer river flow. You tighten your cloak and squint toward a group of figures near the boats. Nets swing, boots slosh through wet gravel, and the unmistakable aroma of fish, strong, briny, borderline personal, greets you like an old, slightly rude friend. You step over a pile of gutted herring silver scales, glittering like coins in the slanted sun. One of the older men hands you a wriggling cod, still slick with sea life, its mouth agape in frozen judgment. This is breakfast's second act, no more gruel. Now it's time to bring in the good stuff. You might have thought Vikings were carnivores to the core, gnawing on roast boar while sharpening axes with their teeth. And, sure, they loved a good slab of meat when it was available. But here's the not-so-sexy truthfish was the real MVP of the Norse diet. Herring, cod, trout, salmon. When in season, they were everywhere. You can dry it, salt it, smoke it, ferment it, if you hate yourself, and eat it raw if you're too tired to cook. It's reliable, plentiful, and blessedly portable. Fish kept Viking bellies full from fjord to forest, from home to longship. You carry your prize back to the fire pits where a few folks are already scaling, gutting, and layering fillets onto planks to roast. The smoke wafts up into your hair, and clothes staining everything with that cozy scent of campfire and mackerel. A young woman drops a fish into the stew pot, just the head and bones for now. Waste nothing, that's the rule. The broth bubbles lazily as she adds leeks and wild thyme, a clump of seaweed for good measure. You wonder if this qualifies as a health tonic. Probably not, but it's warm and salty and smells halfway decent, so you don't complain. There's chatter about a whale spotted last week drifted ashore after a storm. A few brave souls hacked off strips of blubber and tried drying it on sticks. One guy swears it tastes like fat-soaked leather. Another says it's better than goat. Historians still argue whether stranded whales were viewed as gifts from the gods or just really inconvenient rotting meat banks. Either way, someone always ends up eating it. As you help turn the fish on the planks, your fingers go numb. You pause to blow into your palms, then return to work. This is daily life for many Norse folk. Not glamorous, not bloody, just practical. Fish catches meant survival, especially in winter, when grazing animals were scarce and the land offered little else. Still, not all fish were equal. Salted cod, delicious, well, relatively. Fermented herring. That's a crime against the senses. Yet, someone somewhere decided it was worth preserving. You've had it once. You still have nightmares. Some of the cod from earlier gets packed away with salt and layered in small barrels. These will go on the next sea voyage, dried and stiff like kindling. It'll rehydrate in stew or be chewed plain, tough as bark, but nourishing. You once saw a man snap a dried fish in half over his knee. He claimed it was a show of strength. He also dislocated something. You watch a boy bait hooks with tiny slivers of clam and toss them into the shallows. Fishing was a constant rhythm, a heartbeat of coastal life. Morning, noon, and yes, even at night with fires lit along the banks and silhouettes moving in sync with the tide. You recall a story of a Viking who wooed his wife not with poetry or plunder, but with a perfectly smoked trout wrapped in birch bark. She accepted immediately. You wonder if your cooking's ever had that effect. Probably not. The last time you offered someone fish, they threw it at a goat. There's a fringe theory that the Norse also farmed shellfish in rudimentary ways, corralling oysters or mussels in shallow coves. No solid proof, but wouldn't that be something, a Viking oyster bar? Try the mead pairing. It's locally sourced. You sit down on a rock, the warmth of the fire now calling you back. Someone hands you a bowl of fish stew, cod, chunks, onions. Maybe a carrot if they're feeling generous. It's hearty, hot, comforting. You eat slowly, watching the steam swirl upward like tiny ghosts from the deep. A raven caws from a post above, watching hungrily. You toss it a small bone. Odin's bird, someone mutters. You nod. Whether superstition or not, feeding the raven feels right. Maybe it'll put in a good word for you at the next feast. Suddenly, a shout from the shoreline. One of the young boys has slipped into the water soaked to the bone. He's laughing, oddly unfazed. Everyone else groans, already predicting the cold cough he'll develop by nightfall. Someone throws him a fur cloak. He'll dry. Hopefully. You walk back to the longhouse full and slightly fish-scented, your breath curling in the cold. A barrel of salted herring sits just inside the door. You add today's catch to the pile, then cover it with a layer of cloth and a stone lid. That should hold for weeks, assuming no one gets sneaky during the night. Inside, a woman is mashing together fish bits and flour, probably making cakes to fry on the hearth. You watch as she pats them into round, flat discs, then places them carefully onto a hot stone. The smell is oddly inviting. A little char, a little crisp. You might grab one later. Or 5. Your hands still smell of brine and guts. You rub them on your tunic, then think better of it. Too late. Another shirt consigned to the fish pile. By the fire, an older man is mumbling about eels, how they twist like spirits and slip from even the firmest grip. He claims they're good luck if you can catch one. You nod along, only half listening. You've never seen an eel. But if they taste better than fermented shark, you're willing to try. Your mind drifts. What would a Viking sushi look like? A slab of smoked trout on a barley pancake seaweed-wrapped herring roll with pickled turnip. You smirk at the thought. Somewhere in an alternate universe, a Norseman opens a fish-forward food truck. Loki rolls trick your tongue. Back in this universe, though, you're due for more chores. But the fish has done its job. You're warm, full, and alert. You'll sharpen tools later. Maybe fix the net. Maybe avoid gutting duties tomorrow. That smell takes days to leave your hands. You step outside again, the sun now a pale ghost in the afternoon sky. Ice has begun to form in shallow puddles. The boats are being dragged ashore, oars, stacked nets coiled like sleeping serpents. The sea, generous and endless, recedes into itself, promising more, always more. And as you walk back up the path toward home, your stomach humming with fish stew, and the chill wind nipping at your nose, you think, not bad for a day's catch. Not bad at all. By the time you step back inside the longhouse, the light is slanting low through the slits in the timber walls. The shadows stretch and blur across the dirt floor, wrapping themselves around wooden posts like sleepy cats. The hearth still crackles, but the fire's heat feels softer now, less urgent. Someone is passing out strips of dried seaweed and the last of the flatbread from yesterday. You sit down, cross-legged, stretch your legs with a satisfied groan, and chew on a corner of the bread still hard, still solid enough to defend yourself with still vaguely edible. Grain, as you already know, was the backbone of every Viking meal. But now, let's shift to something less humble dairy. From the moment a calf is born or a goat begins to bleat with maternal purpose, the Viking homestead gets to work. Milking is a daily ritual, like fetching water or complaining about how cold it is. You might think milk in that cold. But the Norse were hardy and inventive. Cows, sheep, and goats were milked, and what didn't go straight into drinking cups, often not much was preserved. Altered, and let's say transformed into what we'll loosely call delicacies. You lean back on your hands and recall the big clay pot near the storage end of the longhouse, covered in linen cool to the touch. Inside, clabbered milk, a thick, sour mass that vaguely resembles yogurt, but hits your tongue with more attitude than flavor. It's a survival food, not a party trick. but you've grown used to the tang. Some folks even crave it. And then there's skyr. Think of it like the Norse cousin of Greek yogurt, strained thick, creamy, and packed with protein. It's probably not quite the same as the store-bought stuff with fruit swirls and pastel labels, but it gets the job done. You scoop some onto a piece of flatbread and sprinkle dried herbs over the top. Not bad. Definitely better than the time someone tried mixing fish oil into the batch. That person no longer makes skyr. Historians still argue whether skyr was considered a luxury or just peasant fare. Some claim the Vikings consumed it daily, while others believe it was reserved for special occasions, or stored long-term like a protein-packed emergency fund. Judging by the way it's hidden behind barrels and only spooned out by the matron herself, you suspect it wasn't doled out lightly. You step over to the barrel next to the cheesecloth and peek inside. Butter, pale and crumbly, flecked with what might be dill. Butter was a treasure, especially in winter. Made from churning cream, sometimes aged, always fickle. Without refrigeration, storage was a battle. Some butter was buried in the ground, tucked into cool spots to keep it from turning. You once dug up a jar of it, and were immediately voted least popular person to sit next to during dinner. And the cheese. Oh, the cheese. Not your gooey, modern grilled sandwich stuff. This is a dense, firm goat milk variety. Tart, dry, breaks apart like sandstone and sticks to your molars for days. If it squeaks between your teeth, you've done it right. Or very wrong. You're handed a small cheese cube now rolled in ash for preservation. It looks like something you'd feed to a small rodent, but you pop it into your mouth and chew. Smoky, sharp, slightly alarming. You wash it down with a sip of sour whey because that's what you have. That, or the weak beer made from leftover grain mash. You'd prefer the beer, but this isn't your turn for it. You remember last midsummer when the dairy really flowed. Cows, goats, and sheep grazed freely, fat and happy. There was so much milk that the women made soft cheeses stuffed with herbs and wildflowers. One guy even attempted to dye his cheese blue with crushed berries, an experiment that earned him 3 days of gastrointestinal penance. Still, not all dairy dreams came true. Milk soured fast in warm weather. Containers weren't always airtight, and more than one person has bitten into a curd that had clearly made other plans. One morning, you opened a pot and discovered it had grown its own village of furry residents. You closed the lid and decided fasting was noble. There's a fringe theory that Viking women made ice cream-like dishes in winter using snow and fermented cream sweetened with honey or mashed fruit. There's no hard evidence, but you picture it anyway, a carved bowl of honey snow slush berries peeking through served beside a fire while someone sings a saga about lactose tolerance. Dreamy, isn't it? You finish your cheese brush crumbs from your tunic and glance toward the sleeping areas. A few people have already curled up with sheepskins and lullabies, but others are still by the fire stirring, chatting, passing around a crock of curds. You overhear a joke about a goat that refused to be milked and became a priest instead. Everyone chuckles. It wasn't funny the first time, but by the 20th it's basically tradition. You stand and stretch your joints popping like a row of barley being stepped on. Your hands still smell faintly of milk and salt and wool, an oddly cozy mix. You reach for the drinking horn at your hip, hoping for beer but finding watered milk. You sip it anyway. Not bad. Slightly warm, slightly sour. Definitely nourishing. The baby of the longhouse wails briefly before being offered a bit of sweetened curds from a wooden spoon. You smile. It's not so different from your own meal, just smaller, less chewy. You watch someone wrapping up cheese in cloth, tucking it into a basket for travel tomorrow. Hard cheeses travel well kept dry, they'll last weeks. Some are traded. Others are hoarded like treasure. In the sagas, cheese rarely gets mentioned, but you suspect that's because the heroes were too proud to admit they missed it more than their swords. Someone opens a jar with a loud pop the prized yogurt drink. Slightly carbonated funky in a way that dares you to keep sipping. It's a gamble. You raise your hand and pass this round. No sense gambling with your gut this close to fishing duty again. Still, dairy is life here. It fills the cracks between harder days. It adds richness to a diet otherwise ruled by grains and fish. You remember one elder who claimed butter was sunlight trapped in fat. Poetic, slightly gross, but not entirely wrong. You sit again, closer to the fire, stretching your legs. Outside, the wind howls like a distant war cry. But here, in the warm glow of wood and wool and milk-scented air, you feel something close to content. Not full, not indulgent. Just satisfied, nourished. A low chant begins near the back of the hall, someone humming an old milking song. Slow, repetitive, slightly haunting. It winds through the rafters like smoke wrapping around the beams and settling softly in your ears. You lean back. Your stomach is full of grain and cheese and thick, sour milk. Your limbs are warm, and the hum of the song, the pop of the fire, the faint slosh of curds being stirred, all of it blurs together like a lullaby written in steam and ash and goat's breath. And you think maybe tomorrow they'll let you churn the butter. That barrel's due anyway. Besides, you've got the arm for it. The fire dims to glowing embers, soft red pulses nestled in blackened ash as the longhouse settles deeper into its nightly hush. Outside, the wind continues its endless wandering, rattling the wooden walls and sneaking under the thatched roof like a cold gossip. You pull your wool cloak tighter, eyes growing heavy, but the flicker of lamplight catches a glint near the hearth. A woven basket half covered with linen, its contents still steaming faintly. Someone lifts the cloth, and there they are. Barley cakes. Freshly griddled, faintly nutty with just a hint of smoke and effort. Barley was the Norse workhorse, humble, hardy, and completely indispensable. You couldn't walk 3 paces in a Viking settlement without bumping into a barrel of sack or a sticky handful of barley mash. You take one of the warm, dense cakes, still slightly soft in the middle, and break it in 2. A wisp of steam curls up along with the toasty scent of scorched grain and hot stone. You bite in. Chewy, coarse, a little bland, but it's warm and solid. And that's enough. Now, barley wasn't just for bread. It was the base of nearly everything. Gruel barley, beer barley, thick stews on desperate nights, more barley. The grain grew well in the tough Scandinavian climate surviving frost and stubborn soil, and it stored easily once dried, though rats had a lifelong vendetta against it, judging by the constant traps and curses whispered at their squeaky feet. You shuffle toward a wooden bowl by the wall half full of barley porridge from the morning. Cold now, with a skin like a tired drum. Someone tosses in a splash of goat milk and sets it near the fire. A little stir, a little patience, and it'll be edible again. That's Viking recycling. They say oats were used too, but rarely. Rye showed up in some wealthier farms. Wheat. That was the diva of the grains harder to grow, imported, sometimes treated like edible gold. Only the rich or lucky got regular wheat bread. You've tasted it once, lighter, softer, more forgiving. Almost sinful, really. But barley had endurance. It didn't need pampering. Grind it fine for flour, leave it coarse for soup. You've eaten it as dumplings in broth, as dry cakes in a traveler's pouch, even once mixed with dried apples and honey in what was either a dessert or a prank. Jury's still out. Historians still argue whether the Vikings used leavening techniques like sourdough starters or wild yeast to make their bread rise. Most evidence points to flatbreads, thin, quick functional, but a few rare oven sites suggest someone somewhere was playing with puffier ambitions. You once met a man who swore he'd perfected Viking sourdough. He kept his starter alive using only spring water and promises. The resulting loaf could break a tooth, but it smelled divine. Tonight, the barley cakes are served with a smear of butter and a slice of dried goat sausage. You fold the two together like a rustic taco and chew slowly, your jaw doing most of the heavy lifting. Still, it sticks to your ribs in the best way. The kind of food you can fight a sea monster after, or, more realistically, chase sheep in a downpour. You remember helping with the barley harvest once. Long summer days, the sun barely dipping below the horizon, the golden stalks swaying in rhythm with the wind. It was back-breaking, and itchy work beards full of chaff eyes, watering from dust. But there was a strange beauty to it. That much barley stacked together looked like treasure. Edible treasure that could get slightly moldy if you weren't careful, but still. Someone near the door thumps a barrel with satisfaction. It's beer o'clock. But this isn't modern fizzy hop-laden bliss. Viking beer, more like a thick barley mead, is often cloudy low alcohol and full of bits. Bits of grain, bits of herbs, bits of unidentifiable texture. You take a sip from a shared cup and let the malty tang coat your tongue. Hints of honey maybe, and yarrow. Possibly birch bark. Definitely a few surprises. Brewing was often done by the women of the household. And it wasn't just about fun, it was medicine, hydration, celebration, and nutrition all in one foamy gulp. You've even heard of a batch laced with bog myrtle to add bitterness back when hops weren't widely used. Bold move. Tasted like herbal regret. And when the beer failed, barley tea. Or just plain warm barley water with a dash of salt and milk. It's comfort food, if your idea of comfort includes chewing your drink. You glance toward the rafters where dried herbs and grains dangle like upside-down ghosts. Sage, thyme, a suspicious sprig that might be wormwood. Dried barley heads tied with twine sway faintly in the draft. Ritual or storage? Hard to tell. In this world, it's often both. There's a fringe theory that barley was used in fortune-telling, tossed in fire, or scattered on icy lakes to read patterns and omens. No real proof, but you can't help but imagine a seer squinting at soggy barley and muttering, "Ah yes, the grains foretell." Another cold winter. You pick at the edge of another cake, this one slightly burned. The charred bits taste like last week's hearth smoke, but you finish it anyway. Waste nothing. That's the rule. Even if your taste buds beg for mercy. Beside you, someone is stirring barley gruel with a carved stick. It's for tomorrow's breakfast. Already lumpy. Already inevitable. And despite it all, the repetition, the blandness, the ever-present crunch of undercooked grain, you feel a weird affection for this humble staple. It's unglamorous. It won't win awards. But it shows up. Day after day, meal after meal. Just like you. You lean back, watching the sparks pop in the hearth, like tiny stars belly full of bread and beer and stubborn tradition. Somewhere deep in the shadows, someone snores gently. A baby cries once then settles. The wind taps at the wooden walls, testing their patience. And in this sleepy warmth, surrounded by the scent of toasted grain and old wool and ember-dried socks, you find a quiet kind of peace. Barley has that effect. It doesn't thrill you. It just holds you together. The morning doesn't so much arrive as it seeps in gray and cool, dripping from the rafters like fog in a bowl. The first sounds are soft, the creak of wood, the rustle of wool blankets, a faint snort from the goat outside who still doesn't understand that it is in fact a goat and not a guard dog. You sit up slowly, spine clicking like old ice. The longhouse smells of ash wool and whatever barley dreams ferment overnight. Today is a fishing day. You grab your cloak, still damp from yesterday, and step outside into the chill. The air is sharp and salty, as if the sea has a personality, and it's a little passive-aggressive. Your breath clouds out ahead of you as you make your way down the winding path toward the rocky shore, where the boats sit like sleeping beasts, ribs of wood tied together with more hope than logic. Fishing was never optional. The sea was both pantry and peril. You climb into the low, wide boat with two others and push off into the morning mist, your hands raw against the wet oar handles. It's quiet out here, save for the water slapping wood and the occasional groan from your stomach, which knows fish is coming and isn't entirely sure it wants it. Back at the settlement, fish is a staple. Salted, smoked, dried, fermented Vikings did things to fish that modern food inspectors would weep over. You remember your first taste of fermented herring. One bite. One eye-watering, soul-questioning bite. And yet somehow now you crave it. Sometimes, at the right angle, with enough ale. The lines go overboard with a soft plunk baited with scraps from yesterday's meal. You wait, and stare into the water where kelp waves like lazy hands and the occasional ripple hints at something with teeth. Cod is the prize. Thick, meaty, dependable. Caught in icy waters and dried on racks until it could double as roofing material. Once rehydrated, it's not bad, especially with a bit of butter and herbs. Herring's another common catch. Smaller, oilier, but easy to catch in schools and excellent for pickling. There's a joke in the village that if you trip in spring, you land on a herring. Someone near the bow grunts, hauls in a net, and flops a fish onto the deck. You help hold it down with your boot as it's quickly gutted and tossed into a barrel. The guts. Those'll become bait, or stew, or something. Nothing goes to waste. That's the rule again. Historians still argue whether the Vikings regularly used hooks and lines or preferred nets, traps, and spears. Most agree it was a mix, whatever worked basically. The sea didn't care about your gear, only your luck. And then there's the fish you don't talk about. Eel. Slippery, suspicious, and hard to kill. You once spent an hour wrestling one that refused to die out of pure spite. It later escaped the bucket and was found 3 days later curled up inside someone's shoe. That someone now wears wooden clogs just in case. The boat rocks gently as the sun finally peeks through a crack in the clouds. The light turns the water to pewter. You've hauled in a few good ones now. Enough for the stew pot tonight, maybe, even to dry a batch over smoke if you're lucky. You head back to shore arms, sore stomach, complaining like a fussy chieftain. Back at the longhouse, the fish are laid out like glistening trophies. Scaled, gutted, salted. Salt was precious, sometimes gathered from tidal flats. sometimes traded for occasionally just imagined. You sprinkle it sparingly, letting the crystals settle into the flesh. Then you hang the fish from a smoking rack over a low fire. The smoke curls upward, thin and blue, smelling of juniper and old pine. This will take hours, maybe days. You keep the fire low and steady like tending an introvert. You snack on some dried fish from a previous batch, hard to chewy a bit like licking the inside of a boat. But it fills the corners of your belly, and that's what matters. Fish was often eaten cold, or thrown into porridge or mashed into flatbreads. If you got lucky, someone made fish cakes bound with barley and herbs, and fried on a hot stone. If you got unlucky, someone tried to serve fermented fish without warning you first. Ah, fermented fish, the food that builds character. Lutefisk, rackfisk names whispered in fear and reverence. Fish buried rotted, softened with lye or just time. The smell alone could wake the ancestors. You remember your first encounter a spoonful dared on a feast day chewed bravely through watering eyes, applauded mostly because you didn't pass out. It tastes sharp, tangy, wrong in principle, but surprisingly right on a cold night with no better options. There's a fringe theory that fermented fish was used in religious rituals offered to the gods to ensure good harvests or safe voyages. No solid proof, but if you were a deity, watching someone eat that willingly, you'd probably grant them a favor out of sheer admiration. Someone calls you over to help clean the last batch. You gut a small herring hands slick with oil and brine. The bones come out clean. The flesh is silvery, almost pretty. You lay it out on the drying rack with the rest. Tomorrow it'll be stiff and sharp-smelling but edible. And the day after it'll be dinner. As evening approaches, you join the others by the fire. A pot of fish stew simmers thick with root vegetables, barley, and enough herbs to pretend it's fancy. You take a bowl, steam curling up into your face, and inhale the scent of salt and smoke and effort. It tastes like the sea if the sea had spent a week in a clay pot with turnips. You sip slowly. Around you the others chew and chat and complain. Someone's lost a boot. Someone else burned the bread. The goat has climbed onto the roof again. But the stew is warm, the fire is kind, and the salt lingers pleasantly on your lips. You stretch out beside the hearth bowl, balanced on your knee belly, full of fish and barley and smoke. The wind still whispers, but softer now. The longhouse creaks like a ship at anchor, and you think maybe tomorrow will be herring again, or maybe eel. Or maybe just maybe someone will find that buried jar of pickled trout from last winter and forget why it was buried in the first place. You chuckle to yourself and close your eyes. Dreams will come easy tonight. Dreams of silver scales, flicking tails, and that eel that still owes you a shoe. The fire's embers still glow faintly in the hearth as you stir awake the earthy scent of smoke lingering on your cloak. Your back protests as you sit up. Sleeping on straw-stuffed bedding isn't exactly spa-level comfort. But outside, the light has shifted again. The sun has risen just enough to paint the horizon with streaks of pale gold. And somewhere behind the longhouse there's a soft cluck. Then another. The chickens are awake, which means one thing. It's egg day. Well, not always. Chickens don't lay like clockwork in this climate. And keeping them safe from foxes, cold snaps, and the occasional overly curious toddler is a job in itself. But on days like this, when you're lucky, a few warm eggs rest nestled beneath the feathers and straw waiting to be gathered. You pull on your boots and head outside. The morning dew soaks into the leather cool against your toes. You duck under the rough timber awning and lift the lid of the first coop. A hen eyes you suspiciously, feathers fluffed in indignation. You murmur a soft apology as you reach under her warm, surprisingly warm, and pull free a single brown speckled egg. You grin. Breakfast just got interesting. Vikings didn't eat eggs every day. Hens were too valuable to overtax, and their egg-laying slowed dramatically in winter. But when available eggs were used in every way imaginable, boiled, baked into dense barley cakes mixed into puddings, and even occasionally dropped into stew. Raw. Well, if you're brave. Or hungover. You crack the egg gently into a small clay bowl. The yolk is golden, almost orange, far richer than the pale supermarket variety. You stir it with a carved wooden spoon and add a pinch of salt, a splash of milk, and a handful of foraged herbs. Wild garlic, maybe. A touch of crushed juniper. You're making a scrambled concoction on a flat stone beside the fire, watching the edges bubble and firm up with patient heat. Historians still argue whether eggs were regularly incorporated into bread and cakes or saved mainly for feast days and medicine. In a world where every calorie counted, the protein punch of an egg was a gift and likely not squandered without reason. You remember a healer once dabbing raw egg onto a burn, whispering some nonsense about the yolk drawing out bad spirits. Whether or not it worked, you mostly remember the smell. Egg and wound is not a perfume you'd recommend. Nearby, someone pours a small cup of goat's milk into a clay vessel. Fresh milk, still foamy, still warm. Goats, like hens, were dual-purpose wonders, milk meat, and just enough attitude to keep the village on edge. You once watched one eat half a tunic before anyone noticed. No regrets, no remorse. Vikings used milk in all its forms, raw, boiled, curdled, churned. Butter was precious, usually salted and buried in clay jars for storage. Cheese was common too, soft, squeaky curds or hard dry wheels that could survive long voyages. You slice off a wedge of aged goat cheese and nibble while your eggs finish cooking. Tangy, sharp, slightly suspicious. Perfect. You sit by the fire, balancing a crude plate on your knees, and eat your scrambled eggs slowly. They're fluffy in a rugged sort of way. The herbs give it a fresh kick, and the cheese melts in little oily puddles across the top. Not bad. Not bad at all. You offer a bite to a friend across the hearth. He snorts, claims he'd rather eat bark, then steals a mouthful anyway. Classic. It wasn't just chicken eggs in the Viking diet. Ducks, geese, and even seabirds occasionally contributed if you could find and reach their nests without being pecked to death. There are even fringe claims that swan eggs were considered delicacies reserved for chieftains or rare ceremonies. No solid proof, but imagine the size of that omelet. On feast days, you've seen eggs boiled and dyed with onion skins and birch ash set out in bowls like precious stones. One winter, someone managed to make a custard with eggs, honey, and thick cream. It was more solid than smooth, but still disappeared in minutes. And of course, eggshells were saved. Ground up for medicine, or tossed in the fire with a whisper to ward off evil. Superstition or sanitation. Maybe both. You've seen stranger rituals. Remember the barley tossed on frozen lakes. As the day moves on, the food shifts from delicate eggs to heartier fare. You're helping churn butter now, working a wooden plunger up and down in a sealed barrel. It's rhythmic, almost meditative. Slosh, squish, slosh, squish. Your arms ache, but the result is worth it. Soft, yellow butter rising to the top, flecked with curds smelling rich and grassy. You skim it off with practiced fingers and pat it into rough shapes, pressing some into a clay jar to salt and save. The rest spread on leftover barley cakes from yesterday. The transformation is magic. Crumbly grain transformed into something indulgent with just a smear of butter and a pinch of sea salt. There's an old woman in the village who swears by butter as a cure-all. Dry skin, butter. Sore throat, butter and honey. Bad dreams, butter on the forehead. You tried that once. Mostly just woke up oily and annoyed. The children play nearby, sucking on butter-smeared turnips like lollipops. You wrinkle your nose, but hey, no judgment. They look happy. As evening draws near, you notice the hens settling in again. You wonder if they'll give more eggs tomorrow. Maybe enough for a pudding. Maybe enough to trade. One particularly large goose eyes you from the corner. You make a note not to turn your back. Honk once if you feel threatened. You sit by the fire again, full from a day of slow eating and slower work. Eggs, cheese, butter. It's a small miracle that such fragile foods made it into your diet at all. They're not flashy. They don't inspire poems. But they remind you that nourishment doesn't have to be grand. It can be soft, subtle. A yolk cradled in straw. A pat of butter on a cold cake. A few stolen herbs on a cracked clay dish. And in the flickering light with smoke curling up and a full belly warming your ribs, that's enough. You close your eyes, the taste of goat cheese still sharp on your tongue, and let your thoughts drift. The hens cluck softly in the dark. The wind carries the scent of straw and feathers. And somewhere, maybe tomorrow, another golden egg waits under warm wings. There's a certain sound that barley makes when it's poured into a wooden trough, like dry rain, like a promise of food waiting to be transformed. You hear it now as you enter the storage hut, a small dark structure tucked beside the longhouse, cool and dry by design. Inside, sacks bulge with grain barley, mostly the Vikings' favorite, not because it was luxurious, but because it survived. Wheat was fussier, rye, unpredictable, but barley was the rugged cousin who showed up late, unwashed, and still got the job done. You reach into the sack, scoop a handful of the rough kernels into your palm. They feel like pebbles, hard, scratchy, determined. Barley was in everything. Bread, porridge, soup. Sometimes all three at once if someone got creative or lazy or both. And today you're going to turn it into flatbread. First you grind. You sit cross-legged beside a pair of large round stones, the quern. One flat, the other with a hole in the center and a handle sticking out the side. You pour the barley into the hole and begin to turn. Slow circles, crunch, scrape. Dust flies up, tickling your nose. Your arm begins to ache somewhere around the third lap, and you're only halfway through a single meal's worth. No wonder people were so lean. Historians still argue whether Viking flour was consistently fine or if most bread came out like edible sandpaper. Given how often you find yourself chewing tiny gravel bits mid-meal, you're voting sandpaper. Once the barley is ground into a coarse meal, you mix it with water. Sometimes a splash of milk if someone's feeling generous. Salt if you have it. Herbs if you're lucky. Then comes the fun part, shaping. You flatten the dough into rough discs, with your palms pressing the edges in to avoid cracking. The result looks like a very sad cookie, and you're proud of it. Baking is done on hot stones near the fire. No ovens, not unless you're in a wealthier household with a clay bake pit. You slide the little bread rounds onto the rock, watch the edges blister and curl as the heat hits. The smell is earthy, toasty. Slightly burnt, but that's traditional. While you wait, someone nearby mashes up leftover porridge into little dumplings to fry. Another uses barley meal as a thickener for stew. And someone else is experimenting again with fermenting the grain into ale. It smells like socks, but you nod encouragingly. You flip your bread, careful not to tear it. It's browning nicely, and with a little goat butter on top, it'll be just right. There's a fringe theory that barley bread was used as currency in some regions, portable, nutritious, and just valuable enough to swap for firewood or eggs. Makes sense. You'd definitely trade a few for someone else to grind the flour next time. You eat one flatbread, fresh off the stone fingers, burned mouth full of crunch. It's chewy with a soft nuttiness that lingers. You dip it in leftover stewfish and turnip today, and it soaks up the broth like a sponge with ambitions. Flatbread was daily food. Functional. Eaten with everything sometimes as a utensil itself. On feast days it might get jazzed up with seeds, honey, or fruit, but day to day it was work bread, travel bread, bare bones survival bread. You pause to glance at the larger loaves set aside for later. These were made with a sourdough starter left to ferment overnight and baked into dense, heavy rounds. They last longer, and they double as doorstops. You've seen people dunk them in hot milk just to soften them enough to chew. Children run by holding small barley cakes like trophies, sweetened with a smear of honey or a handful of berries if the season is right. You can't help but grin. You did that once. Traded a rabbit hide for a handful of crowberries and mashed them into dough like it was high cuisine. The color was magnificent. The flavor a bit like licking a pine cone. But still, it was your creation. Sometimes you think about how every handful of grain meant so much. It had to be grown, harvested, dried, stored, protected. A bad rain, a sudden frost, a rat in the wrong sack, and you were out of luck and calories. That's why people celebrated the harvest. Not out of joy necessarily, but out of relief. You remember a harvest feast a few years back. Someone made barley pudding with milk and honey and topped it with crushed hazelnuts. Richer than it had any right to be. You ate until your belt cried mercy. That same night, someone else tried a barley and fish casserole. That one, less memorable. Or more memorable depending on how strong your stomach was. There's a rhythmic calm to food preparation here. Grind, mix, press, bake, eat. Over and over like breath. And yet somehow each meal feels slightly different. Because no 2 days are the same. One day the water's colder, another the fire's too hot, another you're just off. But barley stays steady. Your edible anchor. Your dense, chewy lifeline. You gather up the extra flatbreads, stack them carefully in a cloth-lined basket. Later, you'll carry them to a neighbor who's been sick. Bread is always welcome. Always needed. One of the elders passes by and mutters a phrase you've heard before. Barley feeds the belly, but wheat feeds the pride. You smirk. Maybe so. But pride doesn't last long in a snowstorm. Bread does. As evening slides in like a lazy fog, you sit again by the fire, a piece of flatbread in one hand, a chunk of goat cheese in the other. The two together are perfect, simple, honest. You chew slowly, watching the fire flicker shadows up the log walls. Outside, someone sings quietly while turning the grain sacks to keep them from molding. You hum along, not quite knowing the words, but knowing the tune. It's a song about seasons, about planting and waiting and hoping. It ends the same way every time, with a whispered wish for next year to be better. You wipe the crumbs from your lap and stretch out on the fur-covered bench. Your belly is full. Your muscles ache in that good, honest way. And your mind drifts barley heavy into that soft, slow quiet where sleep begins. You wonder what tomorrow's bread will taste like. Maybe a little burned. Maybe better. Maybe just familiar. And that's more than enough. The scent hits you before anything else, sweet, sharp, and faintly fermented. You open your eyes to find a small clay pot sitting on the wooden table, sunlight pooling around it like it's some kind of holy relic. Inside, berries. Deep purple crowberries, dark blue bilberries, maybe a few wild strawberries if someone got very lucky. Not the kind of fruit you're used to. There's no giant bananas or glossy apples here. These are small, stubborn, wild things. The kind of fruit you really have to earn. Someone plops down beside you chewing noisily on a handful of berries, like it's no big deal. You raise an eyebrow. Berries are a big deal. In the Viking world, fruit wasn't an everyday snack. It was a gift from the forest, a seasonal pleasure, and occasionally a medicine disguised as dessert. You reach into the pot and pick out a bilberry. It's tart, almost sour, with a faint hint of woodland in the aftertaste. It stains your fingers instantly deep purple that's going to take days to fade. You lick it off anyway. Rustic problems require rustic solutions. Vikings didn't cultivate fruit the way later Europeans would. No neat orchards or tidy rows of vines. Instead, they foraged. Berries grew in bogs, forests, hillsides, and sometimes even near settlements if the goats hadn't already eaten them. The most common were bilberries, cloudberries, crowberries, lingonberries, and wild strawberries, each with their own schedule quirks and occasional risk of bear encounters. Historians still argue whether Viking-age people preserved berries with honey or just ate them fresh and fast. Given the short season and the lack of refrigeration, odds are they did a bit of both. You've tasted a kind of berry mash before, half jam, half fermented goo, all mystery. Not exactly Michelin-starred, but it got the job done. Nearby, someone's boiling a pot of barley porridge. Into it goes a handful of fresh crowberries, darkening the entire mix into a purplish slop. It doesn't look pretty, but the smell is sweet and tart. You watch them stir slowly like they're conjuring a potion instead of breakfast. You're not sure what kind of magic this is, but you want a bowl. There's something satisfying about the way fruit cuts through the heaviness of Viking meals. So much of the food here is root-based, grain-heavy, or fermented within an inch of its life. A handful of berries feels like relief. A splash of brightness in a diet built for endurance, not enjoyment. You remember a time when a friend brought back a bundle of cloudberries from a long hunting trip. They're golden soft and almost creamy in texture, nothing like their more sour cousins. You'd never had anything like them. That night they were mashed into a thick cream and served with roasted hazelnuts. You swore it was the best thing you'd ever tasted. Then again, you also hadn't eaten all day. Starvation can be a great seasoning. Today, the housewife of your longhouse is making a sweet barley cake. It's rare, saved for special days or when someone needs cheering up. The recipe is basic barley flour goat milk, a bit of animal fat, and a fistful of mashed berries stirred into the batter. She spreads it out onto a hot, flat stone and lets it bake slowly by the fire. You sneak a fingerful of the raw batter when she turns her back. She smacks you with a spoon. Worth it. There's another pot nearby this one holding something closer to a syrup. You dip a spoon in its honey mixed with mashed lingonberries aged slightly in a sealed jar. Sweet, sour, tangy. You imagine spreading this on flatbread, or mixing it into porridge, or just eating it straight with a spoon when no one's watching. Which of course you do. Immediately. Later in the afternoon, a group heads out with woven baskets to forage more. You tag along more for the fresh air than anything else. The forest smells of moss and damp bark. You squint at the ground, scanning for the right leaves, the telltale signs of hidden fruit. When you spot a patch of strawberries, you drop to your knees and pluck them one by one. Tiny red and powerfully sweet. You pop one into your mouth, feel the flavor burst across your tongue like summer distilled. You think about how strange it is that something so small can be so alive with taste. The old man beside you grumbles about kids today, not knowing how to tell ripe from rotten. Then he hands you the best strawberry of the bunch, which you suspect he'd been saving. You nod, quietly grateful. Back in the longhouse, someone started to make a rudimentary fruit wine. It's more like a fermented juice, to be honest, but it gets the job done. They crush berries into a clay pot, add water, and a spoonful of honey, then seal it loosely and leave it to bubble. In a few days, it'll fizz. In a week, it'll have a slight kick. In a month, it'll make you question your life choices. You tried some once. It tasted like vinegar and regret. But hey, free booze is free booze. There are stories passed around too about berries used for healing. Lingon berries to treat infections. Bilberries for stomach aches. Even strawberry leaves brewed into tea for fevers. Whether or not they worked is anyone's guess. But when you're living in a place where winters are long and doctors are mostly guesswork, a berry becomes more than just food. It's a lifeline. One woman even swore she used crowberry juice to dye her hair once. You're not sure if that counts as medicine fashion or both. Her hair did look vaguely purplish for a week. No one mentioned it out loud. Vikings knew better than to tease someone with access to sharp tools. As night begins to stretch over the village, you sit outside chewing a handful of dried berries. Someone had the foresight to string them up weeks ago and hang them by the hearth to dry. They're chewy now, intensely flavored. Not quite raisins, not quite jerky. Something in between. You savor the quiet sweetness. The way the tartness still sings through. You think about how these little fruits made it through sun and rain and goat teeth to end up here between your fingers. You take another bite of barley cake, still warm from the fire. The berries inside have melted into little jammy pockets of joy. Your eyes close. Your jaw slows. The day softens around you. Fruit may not have been the backbone of the Viking diet, but it was a welcome surprise. A seasonal delight. A sugary hug from nature when everything else was salted, boiled, or pickled beyond recognition. You stretch your legs, the last bit of cake melting on your tongue, and whisper to the stars. May tomorrow bring another basketful. And maybe fewer bees. The first thing you notice is the smell, salty, tangy, and just this side of suspicious. You follow it through the longhouse past the fire pit and the sleepy dog sprawled like a pile of fur until you reach the storage nook. And there it is. A clay pot sealed with a leather lid, quietly sweating on the shelf like it knows what's inside isn't exactly going to win any culinary awards. You crack the lid. Fish, or something that used to be fish. Fermented. Aged. Slightly slimy. Definitely powerful. A food, yes, but also frankly, a biological weapon. This, you realize, is Viking-style preservation in action. You take a step back and blink the tears from your eyes. Fish was life here. Not just a food group, not just a source of protein. It was survival woven deep into the daily rhythm of coastal and riverside Viking settlements. And when you live in a world without fridges, freezers, or cute little vacuum seal bags, you learn to get very creative with how you make it last. Today, you're about to witness that creativity firsthand. Someone's gutting fresh herring down by the dock, tossing entrails into a bucket destined for chickens or compost or who knows what. The fish themselves, once cleaned and rinsed, are being packed in layers, salt fish, inside a wooden barrel. Simple, brutal, effective. The salt pulls out the moisture, slowing bacterial growth, and most importantly, giving the fish a fighting chance at lasting more than a few days. Historians still argue whether fish like this were always salt-cured or sometimes air-dried first, depending on the region. Some theories suggest certain inland areas had a milder brining method, while coastal regions went full ocean-level salty. Either way, this stuff could travel. On a longship, across trade routes, to the next village, to war. You sit beside one of the workers who hands you a smaller fish, maybe a smelt or a sprat, and shows you how to butterfly it open, press it flat, and lay it across a rack for drying. These racks are tilted, allowing air to circulate beneath the fish and sun to kiss the top. On a good day, it'll dry in just a few hours. On a bad day, you get seagulls' flies and a smell that haunts you. One man mentions a fringe belief that hanging fish on birch branches improves the flavor. Some say it's the oils in the bark. Others just like the way the leaves look swaying over their food. You're not convinced, but it's charming. Birch-blessed fish, why not? Later, back in the kitchen area, the preserved fish comes out to play. Someone unwraps a bundle of dried cod hard as wood and drops it into a pot of boiling water. It smells a bit like sea boots. You watch as it softens slowly, turning from a stiff board into actual food. Add a few root vegetables, a dash of herbs, maybe a spoonful of animal fat, and boom. Viking fish stew. You dip a spoon in and take a taste. It's briny, slightly smoky, and surprisingly hearty. Your teeth crunch on a tiny bone. You pretend not to notice. Nearby, a woman is slicing cold salted salmon into thin strips. She lays them out on a plank, brushes them with honey and herbs, and sets them beside the fire to smoke. You've had this before. It's delicious. Sweet rich, and just oily enough to cling to your fingers for the rest of the day. You're told that on very special occasions, think weddings or major seasonal festivals, they even serve a fermented fish delicacy that's, well, divisive. It involves burying fish in a barrel with layers of herbs, salt, and sometimes sour whey, then letting it sit underground for weeks or months. You've never been brave enough to try it. Today, you are. You take one bite. Your brain immediately questions your life decisions. Your taste buds stage a walkout. And yet, there's something oddly compelling about it. Like blue cheese, or durian, or licking a Viking boot. You sip water, then some mead, then more water. Eventually, the flavor fades. Kind of. You start helping to prepare a fish spread that's far more approachable. They mash preserved herring with goat cheese garlic and chopped wild herbs. It's served on warm flatbread. You bite in and sigh. Now, this is the good stuff, salty, creamy herby. Like Viking pâté. There's talk around the fire about the trade routes fish opened up. Dried and salted fish became a form of currency in some places. If you had fish, you had leverage. You could trade it for grain tools, cloth, or even news from far-off places. It was compact, transportable, and respected. Like Viking jerky with a side hustle. A young girl sits beside you and shares a story about her grandfather, who swore he once caught a trout so big it fed their entire village for 3 days. You nod sagely. Every village has that one legendary fish. The fish that got away or didn't. Viking tall tales always soaked in seawater, and just a little exaggeration. As the day winds down, you help clean the prep area. Fish bones are tossed to dogs or the compost pile. Fish skins, though, those get dried and turned into something useful. Bindings, ties, even rudimentary shoes. Vikings didn't waste much, especially not things that could save your life in a blizzard. Before bed, someone pulls out a smoked eel from the rafters. It's a little dusty, a lot oily, and deeply flavorful. Sliced thin, it goes surprisingly well with pickled turnips and a hunk of hard cheese. You nibble at it, slowly savoring the layers of taste. The salt, the fat, the smoke, the satisfaction of knowing this eel has probably outlived a few chickens. There's something timeless about this preservation process. The idea that you can pull food from the sea, treat it with care, and make it last through the long, dark winter. It's not fancy. It's not always appetizing. But it's clever, and that's what Viking food often comes down to. Ingenuity. Grit. A stubborn refusal to go hungry even if it means eating something that smells like it crawled out of a troll's laundry basket. You lie back near the fire belly, full eyes heavy. Somewhere in the dark, another barrel of fish is being sealed for tomorrow. The sea always generous, the land always ready, and your dreams always slightly fish-scented. You drift off, wondering if you'll ever get that smell out of your clothes. Probably not. But hey, that's what smoked juniper baths are for. You wake up to a strange sound, a soft clinking like stones tapping against metal, followed by a low gurgle. Not a river. Not rain. No, this is the sound of brewing. You follow your nose, earthy, slightly sweet with a faint tingle of fermentation, and find yourself outside a small lean-to, more workshop than kitchen. A man is squatting next to a large wooden tub, inspecting the surface with the air of a wizard reading runes. You peek over his shoulder. Bubbles, steam, and floating herbs you don't quite recognize. "Welcome to the brewery," he says, not looking up. Careful not to sneeze into it. You were not planning to sneeze into it, but now you're paranoid. What you're looking at is mead, one of the oldest known alcoholic beverages in human history. And to the Vikings, it wasn't just a drink. It was a celebration, a comfort, a rite of passage. Something to toast with before a raid and sip quietly during the long winters. Something sacred, even magical. Remember, these were people who believed that the mead of poetry could bestow wisdom and inspiration from the gods themselves. Not that what you're about to taste will make you a poet, but it might make you sing like one. He dips a ladle into the mix and offers you a sip. Warm. Floral. Slightly fizzy. You swallow and feel it bloom in your chest like someone just lit a candle in there. Not bad for breakfast. You look around and notice the ingredients laid out on a nearby table. Honey, of course. Wild raw, harvested with much bravery from very angry bees. Then there are herbs, yarrow juniper, and something that might be bog myrtle. Vikings didn't have hops, so they used whatever local plants gave their brew a punch and a bit of preservation power. Historians still argue whether Viking mead was always alcoholic, or if many brews were closer to herbal tonics with only mild fermentation. After all, the line between boozy beverage and medicinal potion was very blurry back then. You're inclined to believe both existed. There's a difference between the stuff you drink at a wedding feast and the stuff your grandmother gives you when you cough. There's a basket nearby filled with birch bark strips and dried berries, likely for flavor. You pluck a piece of birch and chew on it. Bitter, papery, oddly refreshing. Not what you'd call tasty, but it does make your teeth feel oddly clean. Another brewer is stirring a different pot, this one darker and smokier. This, you're told, is ale. Barley-based, often flavored with smoked malt or dried herbs. Less sweet than mead, but easier to make in bulk. Ale was the daily drink in many Viking households, safer than water, and much more reliable. Even kids drank low-alcohol versions of it like it was Viking Gatorade. A young girl nearby is pounding grain with a heavy wooden pestle, rhythmically like a heartbeat. She adds the crushed grain into a large tub, mixes it with water, and sets it near the fire to steep. Soon it'll be strained and fermented, then left to rest in clay jugs tucked into a cool corner of the house. You remember a tale someone told you about a woman who accidentally left her brew near a smoke hole too long. The result? A smoky ale that her husband loved so much he refused to drink anything else. Thus began the accidental invention of Viking smoked beer. Fringe innovation or just lazy brewing, hard to say. You take a tour of the cellar, not the kind with stone walls and shelves of Bordeaux, but a dugout pit lined with straw and planks. Inside are sealed jugs, amphorae, and pots of every size. Some are labeled with carved symbols, others with small bits of painted decoration. It's cool and dark and smells faintly of yeast and secrets. One pot is cracked open for you. The brew inside has a layer of foam and smells faintly like sour apples. You're warned to sip it slowly. You do. It's tart, mildly carbonated, and leaves your tongue tingling. You're not sure if it's supposed to do that, but you like it. There's a festive energy in the air today, someone's birthday, or maybe a wedding, or perhaps just a good haul of fish. Vikings didn't need a massive reason to throw a party. You help carry jugs of ale and mead to the feast area, where food is being arranged on wooden platters, and kids are chasing each other with sticks pretending to be berserkers. You're handed a drinking horn. Yes, an actual horn, curved, polished, and slightly drippy. It's filled with spiced ale, warm from the fire. You sip and look around at the scene. The long tables, the candles, the laughter, the songs. A man nearby tells you a story about Odin stealing the mead of poetry from the giants and bringing it to the gods. He swears that real mead, the kind brewed with the right herbs under the right moon, can still unlock visions. You smile politely and take another sip. Nothing yet, but you do feel incredibly relaxed. The debate over Viking drinking customs continues long after the first horn is emptied. Some claim they drank in moderation. Others describe wild days-long feasts with dancing, singing, and more than a few drunken brawls. You've seen both, sometimes in the same night. There's a game being played, a kind of drinking contest where people take turns reciting verses, and the first to forget a line has to drain their horn. You're roped in, and somehow manage to rhyme fish gut stew with good as new. Applause erupts. You don't even like poetry, but maybe Odin is smiling on you tonight. A woman offers you a drink she claims is for healing. It's sour mead steeped with juniper ash leaves and something she won't identify. You sip. It tastes like a pine cone having a bad day. She smiles and says it'll cure heartbreak headaches and possibly curses. You nod and tuck the rest into your bag just in case. You notice the way drinking is tied to everything here. Celebration, mourning, storytelling trade. Even negotiations between chieftains often began with a shared horn of ale. It was a sign of trust, or at least a way to soften the tension before someone mentioned goat theft. As the night deepens, torches flicker, and the singing turns into humming. People lean against each other, warm and drowsy. Your horn is empty. Your belly is full. Your head is light. Somewhere in the distance, someone is still brewing, tending the fire, stirring the pot. You lie down on a woven mat, the taste of honey lingering on your tongue. The stars peek through the smoke hole in the roof. You think about the bees that made your mead, the herbs gathered by hand, the barley crushed and stirred with so much care. The drink here isn't just about getting drunk. It's about ritual, memory, a way to hold on to the sun even in winter, a way to feel connected to the gods, to your kin, to something deeper than words. You close your eyes. Horn resting beside you dreams, steeping in your thoughts like herbs in a slow brew. If you're lucky, the mead of poetry might just whisper something to you before morning. You wake to the steady thunk-thunk of a blade against wood, and before you even open your eyes, your brain does that half-sleep guesswork thing, chopping firewood, carving tools. Someone practicing axe throws too early. It's none of those. You sit up, blink the crust of dried mead out of your eyes, and follow the sound to the edge of the settlement where several women are squatting beside a long wooden trough. Inside the trough dough. Outside the trough very committed kneading. The thunk is elbows and fists working hard, driving air out of the heavy, grainy mass. You've stumbled onto the morning's bread prep, and surprise it doesn't involve wheat. Not here. Not often. Because tonight you're diving mouth first into the real star of the Viking table barley. Not flashy, not fancy, definitely not white and fluffy. But barley is everywhere in your Viking life. It's ground into flour, turned into mush, brewed into ale, thickened into soup, and sometimes even just boiled plain and shoved in your mouth because calories are calories. You sit beside the baker in charge and watch her work. The flour they're using is coarse like sand that decided to give baking a try. Some of it is mixed with ground oats, maybe a few wild rye seeds. Wheat, if it's here at all, is barely a whisper, imported rare, and usually saved for the fancy people with fancy longhouses and bigger horns. Historians still argue whether Vikings ever made true leavened bread with yeast, or if most of what they ate was flat dense and somewhere between a pancake and a cracker. What you're seeing today leans toward the latter, a thick, grain-heavy batter being shaped into discs and cooked directly on hot stones near the fire. Someone flips one over with a stick and hands you a fresh piece. It's warm, slightly nutty with a tough outer crust and a soft middle. No fluff. No sourdough starter. Just honest carbs. You bite in and suddenly understand why so many Viking meals included some kind of soup. It helps this stuff go down. A woman beside you shows off a more creative version. Bread wrapped around herbs and onions, then baked in the coals until the outer layer blackens and cracks. Inside it's steaming and fragrant, and you can actually hear your stomach perk up like, yes, That. More of that. They call it ash bread, not because it's from the ashes, but because it literally cooks in them. The outer layer gets sacrificed, so the inside stays tender. You wonder if this is also symbolic of something, but honestly, you're too hungry to wax philosophical right now. You help carry stacks of these flatbreads to the communal table where they're laid out beside bowls of stew hunks of goat cheese and pickled vegetables. You wrap a slice around some smoked herring and take a bite. Better. The chewiness works with the oily fish, and suddenly this meal feels like it has layers. A kid runs by trailing crumbs, and a dog follows close behind hoping for a miracle. The dog gets a crust. Peace is restored. There's another form of barley that makes an appearance around midday porridge. And not the kind you're used to with brown sugar and raisins. This one's thick savory, and has the consistency of wet cement. If wet cement were flecked with chunks of carrot wild greens and maybe a squirrel bone or two. You politely decline to ask. They stir it with a big stick, just a stick, not a spoon, and ladle it into wooden bowls. You're told it keeps people full for hours, which makes sense because you're pretty sure it could also patch a leaky roof. Someone hands you a sweet version, a rare treat. Barley cooked with honeyberries and a little cream skimmed from last night's milk. It's warm, gooey, and shockingly delightful. Like a Viking rice pudding if rice had never existed, and everyone just shrugged and said, "Hey, barley's fine." You learn that grains weren't just food, they were also offerings. Some barley was scattered at the start of a season left in sacred groves, or burned with herbs to ask the gods for good weather and safe travels. One woman tells you she adds a pinch of ground barley to every new batch of mead for luck. Is it superstition, tradition, magic? All of the above. In the corner of the longhouse, someone is grinding more grain with a hand quern, a kind of flat stone, turned by another rounder stone on top. It's slow, repetitive, and deeply meditative in a "please, don't make me do this all day" kind of way. You give it a try. 5 minutes and your arms are jelly and your respect for Viking biceps quadruples. Nearby, a small bundle of grain is tied to the rafters, an old tradition to keep the harvest spirit happy and ensure next year's fields don't rebel. It's dusty and half-nibbled by mice, but no one touches it. Some things you just don't mess with. That night dinner is barley soup again, but this time with added chunks of dried meat, a few crushed nuts, and a dash of something sharp that might be vinegar or might be just really sour milk. Either way, it works. You dip your bread in and let it soak. Now, this is the kind of food that hugs your insides. As the fire dies down, someone pulls out a wooden board of crackers. Yes, crackers made from barley flour, rolled thin, pricked with holes, and left to bake on stones until crisp. They snap with a satisfying crack and pair beautifully with the last of the cheese. You even get a smear of that fermented fish paste from earlier. Your taste buds flinch, then adjust. It's fine. It's edible. It's Viking charcuterie. You're told stories about grain theft, how some villagers would sneak into fields late at night and take barley heads before the harvest. Not out of greed, but out of desperation. One man whispers that in the worst winters people ground tree bark into their flour just to stretch it further. Bread made from desperation. Porridge laced with survival. Still, barley endures. Always there. Always humble. Never glamorous. Like the background actor that never gets applause but without whom the play would collapse. You curl up near the hearth, full of warm grain and smoky flavors. You trace a bit of barley flour still stuck to your sleeve and think about how many meals it's snuck into this week alone. Unassuming, necessary, eternal. And as sleep pulls you down, the last thing you hear is the quiet scrape of another stone mill grinding toward tomorrow. Your eyes open slowly to a rhythmic squish sound, like someone walking across a sponge. It's not raining, but it is damp, heavily misted, the kind of fog that makes your hair feel heavier than it is. Outside, a low humming drifts in through the wooden beams. It's the sound of women at work. You wander toward it, still warm from barley porridge dreams, and find a group gathered around a wooden bench stacked with greenery. Long leaves, tough stems, and earthy-smelling roots. This isn't a salad bar, it's a fermenting station. Today, you're discovering something many Viking meals couldn't do without preserved vegetables. Let's be honest, you're not expecting fireworks. Pickled turnip isn't exactly the Beyoncé of Viking cuisine. But as you sit down beside a woman carefully layering leaves into a clay pot, you realize there's more going on here than pickles and salt. This is how they survived winter. This is how they kept eating when the snow made the land unrecognizable. She hands you a chunk of something pale rubbery and slightly translucent. "Try it," she says with a wink. You hesitate, take a bite, and sour, crunchy, a little like sauerkraut, but somehow deeper, earthier. This, you're told, is fermented wild cabbage buried in salt, weighed down with stones, and left to stew in its own juices until it turned into something magical. Or, at least, something edible. Historians still argue whether Vikings used intentional fermentation or if much of it was trial and error. The truth likely lies in both. You can imagine someone forgetting a tub of greens for a week, tasting it on a dare, and thinking, "Hey, not bad." From there, traditions were born. You help wash roots in cold water, a mix of parsnips, turnips, and something knobby that smells like a beet with a hangover. They're sliced with bone knives, salted, and packed tightly into jars that will rest in a cool corner for months. No vinegar, no mason jars, just salt time and patience. There's a pot of pickled fish nearby, tiny herring floating in a brine that smells like the sea met an onion and had an argument. You try a bite. It's intense, salty, slippery. But the longer you chew, the more the flavors reveal themselves, umami bite a hint of dill. Fermentation wasn't just for taste. It was preservation, sure, but also nutrition. Long winters could drain you of fresh vitamins, and pickled greens gave a tangy lifeline. Kids were fed sour mash and pickled roots from a young age, not because they loved it, but because it kept them upright. You find a bucket tucked under a bench filled with odd-smelling milk. It's curdling on purpose. Viking dairy wasn't just for drinking, it was for transformation. Sour milk became a drink. Clabbered cream turned into a thick yogurt-like substance they spread on flatbread. And cheese. Oh yes, cheese was precious. Nearby, someone is cutting a soft cheese that smells surprisingly sweet. It's a curdled milk mix set with rennet from a calf's stomach and left to harden over days. This is not your triple cream brie. It's squeaky dense and a little chalky. You try a slice. Your tongue is confused but intrigued. A woman laughs and offers you another version. This one smoked darker and crumbly. Now this is Viking snack heaven. Pair it with a hunk of ash bread, and you've got yourself a meal that could survive an entire voyage. You learn that some households fermented butter. Yes, fermented butter. storing it in animal bladders or wooden tubs. It darkened over time and took on strong flavors, sometimes sharp enough to make your eyebrows dance. One man swears it cures headaches. You're not so sure. Someone opens a clay pot, and the smell hits you like a sleepy slap strong fermented fish paste. This one's homemade. Think fish sauce, but chunkier. It's used to season soups, enhance broths, and occasionally chase away unwanted guests. You taste the tiniest bit. It numbs your tongue and possibly your soul. Despite the strong smells, there's something oddly comforting about this world of preserved things. It's a kind of quiet wisdom, planning ahead, working with what you have, turning decay into something useful. Modern fridges could never. There's a fringe tradition someone tells you about burying fish in the mud near the river, wrapped in leaves, and weighted down with stones, then digging it up weeks later. Rotten on purpose. Some say it's an old ritual food. Others say it was for desperate times. Historians still argue whether it was widespread or just a regional quirk. You sincerely hope it was rare. You help prepare a fermented soup onions, dried fish herbs, and a scoop of aged cabbage. It simmers low and slow, sending strange but not unpleasant smells into the smoky air. You sip. Tangy, briny, oddly refreshing. Your taste buds have completely given up trying to understand anything and are now just along for the ride. Dinner features a platter of preserved odds and ends, pickled mushrooms, sour plums, even fermented berries that pop in your mouth like tiny flavor bombs. You find yourself actually liking the way each bite surprises you. Sweet, then sour, then bitter, then back to sweet. It's like your mouth is playing Viking roulette. As the sun sets and fog curls around the edges of the village, you realize the brilliance of it all. Fermentation isn't flashy, but it's patient, quiet, resilient. A food philosophy built not on abundance, but endurance. You curl up near a half barrel, still bubbling gently beside the hearth. The scent of sour milk and smoked root vegetables clings to your clothes. Not unpleasant anymore, just familiar. Like the air here knows how to wait. And as you drift off a bowl of fermented greens beside you, you think, maybe survival is less about brute strength and more about knowing how to turn rot into nourishment. The Vikings knew. They left their wisdom in jars. You're awakened not by light or noise, but by a smell. A rich, oily scent that seems to creep into your brain and whisper, "Hey." You hungry, yet you open your eyes slowly and sniff. There it is again. Smoky, a little sweet. Definitely fishy. You sit up and follow your nose to a low building near the edge of the longhouse cluster. Inside, the air is thick with haze and the kind of darkness that flickers with orange. Hanging from the ceiling, dozens, maybe hundreds of fish. Some are whole, others split down the middle and stretched open like strange, scaly books. Welcome to the Viking smokehouse. You made it. This is where food gets serious. Someone hands you a skewer of smoked salmon still warm. It flakes apart the moment your teeth graze it, and oh, there it is. That primal flavor. Salt, fat, and fire. You close your eyes and chew slowly, feeling the oil coat your tongue like a second skin. Now, this is breakfast. They didn't call it food preservation. They just called it eating next month. Smoking was one of the Viking world's favorite tools, and not just for fish. Meat, cheese, even grains got the smoke treatment if time allowed. But fish, especially herring, salmon, and cod, was the gold standard. The smokehouse is like a sauna for protein. A long fire pit in the center burns low with alderwood and juniper. Meat hangs above, soaking up the scent while slowly drying out. You touch a piece of cod that feels like leather dipped in seawater. It's hard as a rock, but dunk it in stew for a bit magic. You learn that some fish were air-dried instead, strung up on racks along windy coastlines. Stockfish, they called it. Unsmoked, pale, and light enough to carry across oceans. You bite a corner of one and nearly chip a tooth. It's no snack. It's a promise. Historians still argue whether stockfish was mainly for export or everyday Viking fare, but either way, it traveled far. Norway's cold winds turned fish into currency. You wonder what it must have been like to sail with sacks of petrified cod as your prized cargo. Probably smelly. Definitely profitable. You help lay out fresh-caught herring to dry tiny silver bodies, laid in neat rows like little armor plates. Some are salted first, others left plain. The air smells sharp with brine, smoke, and sun. Someone slices a fatty salmon belly and begins to cure it, rubbing it with a mix of salt, crushed juniper berries, and wild herbs. No measuring, just instinct. It's wrapped in birch bark and laid under a heavy stone. In a few days it'll be soft, fragrant, and ready to eat raw. Gravlax ancient style. A boy runs in with a woven basket of seaweed. Flavor, he says. You raise an eyebrow. Seaweed wasn't always a centerpiece of the Viking table, but in coastal communities it found its way into broths, pickling jars, even mixed into bread. It's dried and chewed like jerky or soaked into soups for that briny boost. You chew a strip. It's like licking a rock but saltier. You pretend to like it anyway. For lunch, you're served a stew made with smoked lamb, dried onions, and shredded root vegetables. There's even a smoky cheese crumbled on top. The flavor is deep comforting, like an edible campfire hug. You dip flatbread into the oily broth and savor every bite. A dog watches you jealously. A woman tells you a story, half memory, half myth, about a time the smokehouse caught fire during a storm. They lost a whole season's food. That winter, the village had to survive on broth made from fish heads and pine bark. You nod stomach, suddenly grateful for the full bowl in your hands. Later in the day, you help prepare fish for a longer voyage. Each piece is salted, wrapped in clean cloth and packed into barrels. The sea's a thief, someone mutters. It takes your food, your strength, your men. So, pack tight. You don't argue. You try a slice of whale meat, smoked dense and almost sweet. Not common, not daily fare, but in coastal areas a whale carcass meant weeks of eating. Tongue, blubber, muscle, even cartilage found its way into a dish or a stew pot. Waste not. Especially not something the gods probably sent your way. You help sharpen knives. Slice fillets. Hang fresh trout by the tail, watching them swing gently in the heat. It's hypnotic in a slightly grim way, but there's pride here too. You see it in the way the smokehouse is tended, the way people test for doneness with a glance or a press of the finger. There's even a kind of hierarchy. The best smoked fish saved for feasts or honored guests. The rest eaten, traded, or packed for journeys. A well-smoked fish could last months, maybe more. They'd wrap it in linen, tie it with cord, and pray the mold didn't win. Someone jokes that the smell of smoke follows you forever. You sniff your tunic. Yep, you smell like a Viking deli. And honestly, it's kind of comforting. Before sleep, someone shares a bit of smoked eel, oily, slippery, and strangely good. You chew slowly, savoring the richness the way it coats your mouth like a secret. No one speaks. It's a sacred moment, a snack-sized miracle of salt and flame. As night falls, the smokehouse glows gently in the dark, a warm heart beating in the cold. You curl up near the edge, eyes half closed, and let the scent wrap around you like a blanket. And in that haze of warmth, fish, and fire, you realize something odd. In a world without fridges, without pantries, without expiration dates, smoke isn't just preservation. It's memory. It's care. It's survival that tastes like something. You wake to a different kind of noise this time. Not chatter, not chopping, not the smoky crackle of firewood, but a distant hum that grows louder with each breath. You peek outside, blinking at a line of figures trudging back from the hills, baskets slung across their shoulders. Some are whistling, some are chewing. All of them carry bundles of green, brown, and purple. Foraging day. A Viking treasure hunt, but instead of gold, it's mushrooms, berries, and weird stuff growing on rocks. Someone waves you over, and before you can ask what's in the basket, they plop a handful of dark, wrinkled things into your palm. Dried berries. Sour, sweet, a little musty. Like raisins if raisins had lived a harder life. You chew one. It punches your tongue with tartness, then melts into a honeyed aftertaste. Berries were a seasonal jackpot for the Norse lingon berries. Crowberries, juniper, wild strawberries. Eaten fresh in summer, preserved in honey, or dried for winter. A burst of sugar when snow was the only other flavor. You follow them into the woods' feet, crunching softly over moss and needles. Every step brings a new scent, earth pine, the sharp edge of crushed nettle. You learn quickly that Viking foraging wasn't just wild guessing. It was inherited memory. People knew what to pick when and where to find it. A woman points to a patch of low-growing herbs. Wild thyme. She crushes some between her fingers, and the aroma punches you right in the memory. Like a medieval pizza topping. You help gather bunches, stuffing your bag with leaves that'll dry in the rafters later to flavor broths and season meat. Mushrooms come next, fat, brown-capped ones that smell like rain-soaked bread. Historians still argue whether Vikings embraced fungi wholeheartedly or with suspicion. Some sagas hint at magical mushrooms. Yes, those mushrooms used by berserkers before battle. Others suggest people stuck to what didn't kill them. You help gather a variety that resembles chanterelles, chewy, nutty, delicious once dried, and added to stews. Another woman slaps your hand away from a blue-spotted cap. Bad dreams, she says. Fair enough. There's a wild debate around sea buckthorn, those bright orange berries packed with vitamin C. Some scholars think Vikings consumed them regularly, especially near coastal areas, while others argue the evidence is too thin. Either way, you eat one. It's like a lemon and a chili pepper had a screaming match in your mouth. You also discover sorrel tart leaves shaped like hearts. Vikings likely used it in soups, or chewed it raw for that zingy pick-me-up. Someone wraps it in a bit of smoked cheese and hands it to you like a canapé. It's weirdly great. There's even a root they dig up, meaty, stringy beige. Angelica, someone tells you. Medicinal, but also edible. Slightly sweet. Once it was so valuable that it was cultivated intentionally in some parts of Scandinavia. Chewed for strength. Used to treat colds. Today, you bite into it like a Viking carrot and hope for the best. The farther you go, the more curious the discoveries. Lichen that's boiled 3 times to make it edible. resin scraped from trees and chewed like gum, salt from evaporated sea foam, even birch bark tea steeped, strained, and surprisingly pleasant. You sip and raise your eyebrows. Not bad for tree juice. You gather armfuls of nettles, carefully of course. Once blanched, they're not only edible but rich in iron. Used like spinach. Great in soups. Terrible if you touch them wrong. You get stung once and vow revenge on all greenery. Lunch is served on a blanket in the woods, a foraged salad of greens, cured fish mushrooms, and tart berry sauce. There's flatbread spread with soft herb cheese, and a few dried apples passed around like gold coins. You lean back against a tree chewing slowly, feeling both primal and very slightly fancy. A man points out a flowering plant and warns you off. Good for curses, he mutters. Some plants weren't food, they were folklore. Used in rituals, hung in doorways, tucked under pillows. Viking foraging wasn't just about eating. It was about survival belief and superstition. You learn about mistletoe, feared, revered, avoided. Said to have magical properties. Never burned. Never fed to animals. Historians still argue whether its role was more medicinal or symbolic, but either way, no one touches it today. Except that one goat. He seems fine. You wander back with the group as the sun begins to dip. The baskets are heavier now. So are your limbs. Foraging is no lazy stroll. It's a full-body grocery run with zero guarantees. Back at the settlement, the foraged goods are sorted. Some will be dried on wooden racks, some cooked into soups, others mashed into paste or syrup. A woman begins stewing berries with honey and crushed hazelnuts. The smell draws a crowd. You're handed a wooden bowl, sweet porridge swirled with juniper berries, and a scoop of the fresh berry mix. You dig in. It's sour and nutty, the sweetness lurking at the end like a polite guest. You realize you're eating the Viking version of dessert. Someone brews a tea from dried leaves and hands you a steaming cup. It smells like summer and soil. You sip, eyes fluttering closed. It's the kind of drink that doesn't taste like much at first, but lingers quietly, warming you from the inside out. The wind rustles the trees, and you swear you can hear the ancient footsteps of all the gatherers who came before. Quiet hands, bent backs, sharp eyes. People who knew what fed them, what cured, what killed, what kept them alive through winter. You settle down near the hearth, your fingers stained with berry juice and dirt, your stomach full of forest. Foraging wasn't glamorous, but it was intimate, close to the land, and in its own quiet way, beautiful. You fall asleep thinking of herbs strung across rafters, mushrooms drying in neat rows, and baskets filled with wild color. No plastic, no preservatives, just hands, instinct, and trust. The next morning starts cold enough to turn your breath into fog. You tug your cloak tighter and make your way toward the communal fire. Something smells sweet, earthy, and oddly familiar. You peek over a pot and spot something bubbling thickly. Grains, maybe oats cooked down with bits of dried fruit and herbs. Breakfast Viking style. Grains, the humble heroes of Norse meals. You may have pictured the Vikings as pure meat machines gnawing on bones like a cartoon barbarian. But here's the twist. Grains were everywhere. Barley, rye, oats grown, traded, stored, and turned into everything from bread to beer. Yes, even porridge. You scoop a spoonful of the hot mix and blow gently. The grains are chewy, slightly nutty with pops of tart berry, and the mellow softness of cooked apple. It's surprisingly comforting, like something your grandma might have made if your grandma lived in a fjord and owned a sword. Barley was the big one, easy to grow hardy enough for cooler climates and versatile. You see someone grinding it into flour with the stone quern muscles flexing with each rhythmic turn. The flour collects in a wooden bowl, coarse and pale, waiting to become something magical. Rye came later and wasn't as common in the earlier Viking age, but by the later periods, it had taken root in parts of Scandinavia. Oats, a hearty staple. You watch someone roll them between their fingers like gold dust, preparing them for the next meal. A group gathers near a flat stone slab, kneading dough. It's simple flour water, maybe a touch of salt if you're lucky. No yeast here unless some natural spores sneak in. Flat breads and griddle cakes rule the day. You help press around into shape, then slap it onto a hot stone over the fire. It sizzles, blisters, and darkens at the edges. You rip off a corner. Warm, chewy, smoky. Honestly, pretty decent. It's no croissant, but it does the job. Bread was often made daily, since without modern preservatives it went stale fast. Some loaves were baked directly on hot stones, others in clay ovens if the household had one. They could be thick and dense or surprisingly thin, more like crackers. Sometimes dried fruits or seeds were added for flavor. Sometimes they were just there. Historians still argue whether the Vikings commonly used sourdough starters or relied on simpler, faster methods. Sourdough requires time and care, but it lasts longer and has that signature tang. Some archaeological finds suggest traces of fermentation. Others say the evidence is too sparse. You try around with herbs kneaded in thyme and wild garlic. It tastes like the forest married a bread roll. Another woman offers you a slice smeared with butter and crushed berries. You nod in deep, sleepy approval. The Vikings may not have had Nutella, but they knew how to spread joy on carbs. Then there's the grain soup, a kind of thick gruel made with barley chopped greens, bits of dried meat, and a lot of patience. You help stir a pot for what feels like an hour. Someone jokes that the soup's only done when you've aged a year. You finally get a bowl and find yourself scraping every drop. It's hearty warm and surprisingly rich. You help sift through sacks of dried grain, checking for mold or pests. Storage was critical. Most grains were kept in large wooden bins or clay pots, often buried partially underground or tucked into cool corners. Spoiled grain could mean disaster come winter. A boy drags a big wooden tub toward the fire. You peer inside and see a mash of wet, bubbling barley. "Beer," he says, grinning. You grin back. Fermentation wasn't just for fun. It was preservation, hydration, and community all in one. Viking ale was low in alcohol, but high in calories, making it a kind of drinkable meal. The grain mash was boiled strained and left to ferment with wild yeast or added herbs like bog myrtle. Hops weren't the standard yet, but other bitter herbs filled the role. You sip a ladleful of the weak brew. It's cloudy sour with a grassy aftertaste. Not exactly a party drink, but after a day of hauling sacks and dodging goats, it goes down smooth. You're shown a different kind of grain product, something like a cracker. It's thin, dry, and hard enough to survive a voyage to Valhalla. These were travel breads, baked until moistureless, and stored for long journeys. Dunked in soup or tea, they came back to life. Sort of. There's also mention of sprouted grains, an early attempt at boosting nutrition. Letting grains sprout before grinding them into flour could soften the flavor and add a bit of sweetness. You try a slice of bread made this way. It's subtly different, richer somehow, like the grain wanted to be a little fancy before it met your teeth. Someone pulls out a small cake made of oat flour, honey, and berries. It's dense and chewy like an ancient granola bar. A perfect snack for travelers or for bribing children into doing chores. You pocket one for later. You sit near the quernstone again, watching the steady back and forth of the grinding process. A little girl takes a turn humming as she works. It's a rhythm older than cities, older than books. You realize how many hands have done this quietly, patiently, because without this work, no one eats. Later, a woman dusts off an odd-looking seed from her pouch. She calls it flax. You raise an eyebrow. Vikings didn't eat flax often, but they used its seeds occasionally for oil or even ground into meal. More famously, the plant made linen useful for clothes wrappings, even fishing lines. You munch a flax seed and immediately regret it. Chewing sand might be more rewarding, but in bread, crushed up and baked. Surprisingly okay. High in nutrients, full of fiber. The kind of thing that makes you feel slightly superior after eating. As the day cools and smoke curls from the hearth, you enjoy one final bowl of barley stew. This one thicker with more herbs, and a few chunks of cheese melting inside. You cradle the bowl in your hands, letting its warmth seep through your fingers. Grains may not have the flashy reputation of meat or the wild mystery of foraging, but they're the glue that held Viking life together. Cheap, filling, flexible. A food of the people and the practical gods. You curl up by the fire with your half-stale travel bread and leftover porridge content in the knowledge that, for all their sword-swinging and seafaring, the Vikings knew one simple truth: never underestimate the power of a good bowl of grain. You wake up to a distant thunk. Thunk, thunk. Not the ominous sound of an axe in a horror movie, but something more rhythmic. You follow the noise past the fire pit down a slope and into the smokehouse. Inside, it's dark, lit only by the fire's embers and tiny holes in the wooden walls that let in threads of morning light. The air is thick with the scent of burning wood and cured meat. Your nose twitches. Your stomach grumbles. Welcome to the smoky, slow-cooked world of Viking preservation. Someone tosses a log onto the fire. It hisses. You catch a sight of fish hanging from the rafters, silver skin curling gently, oil dripping into a shallow trench below. Meat, fish, even cheese, they all go through some kind of preservation. Not because the Vikings were gourmet chefs, but because if they didn't preserve their food, they'd be in big trouble come winter. Today's starfish. And lots of it. You spot cod, herring salmon, even something suspiciously eel-like. Viking diets leaned heavily on the sea not just for fresh meals, but for preserved ones that could last through voyages, sieges, and brutal cold months. Drying was the oldest method. Fish split splayed and left to hang in the cold wind until it hardened into something almost indestructible. Stockfish, they called it. It looked like jerky, but with the personality of a brick. Chewed properly, though it softened just enough to swallow without breaking a tooth. You try a sliver. It's salty, chewy, and oddly satisfying. Like fish bubblegum. And yes, it definitely grows on you. Salted fish was also big. Salt pulled moisture from the flesh, keeping bacteria at bay. But here's the catch: salt wasn't easy to get in every Viking region. Near the coasts, they boiled down seawater to extract it, painstaking work. Inland salt was precious, traded, hoarded, used carefully. Historians still argue whether salt was common enough to be a household staple, or mostly reserved for the wealthy and seafarers. Some evidence suggests families had access through trade. Others believe most relied more on drying and smoking. You help rub salt into a batch of fresh salmon, then place it in a wooden barrel lined with herbs. Not just for flavor, some herbs helped keep mold and bugs away. Juniper, for instance. You crush some berries and toss them in. The scent rises like a forest exhale. You move on to meat. Pork ribs hang above the fire, their fat slowly dripping onto coals. Further back, hunks of lamb and goat wrapped in cloth smolder gently. The smokehouse is an orchestra of aroma, sweet wood, sharp fat, spiced undertones. No wonder you're dizzy. Smoking wasn't just about taste. The compounds in smoke helped preserve the food by forming a protective layer. Cold smoking was more common. It dried the meat slowly over days or even weeks. You turn a haunch of venison with a hooked stick, trying not to drool on your own feet. Next, a woman opens a clay pot and pulls out cured sausage. Dark, slick, and tightly coiled. She slices off a piece and hands it to you. It's spicy heavy with garlic and wild herbs, probably stuffed months ago. Vikings used intestine casings like modern sausage makers, but their recipes depended on what was available. Sometimes they even used blood in the mix. Blood pudding anyone, you hesitate. But yes, you try the blood pudding. It's rich, meaty, and oddly sweet thanks to dried fruit and barley flour mixed in. You nod. Would eat again. Maybe not daily, but hey, survival's a buffet. Someone shows you a wooden box lined with straw. Inside, cheese. Not the waxy bricks you know, but soft, slightly sour rounds wrapped in cloth. Vikings made cheese from cow goat or sheep milk curdled with rennet or vinegar. Soft cheeses were eaten fresh. The rest smoked salted or aged in cool corners. You bite into a wedge that tastes like a buttery cloud kissed by smoke. Then another that punches you in the tongue. Apparently, some of these cheeses could get intense. There's even butter, thick yellow, and stored in small barrels or animal bladders. Not glamorous, but effective. Preserved butter was essential fat for travel and winter meals. Some evidence suggests they buried it in cool, peaty ground to keep it fresh. Like a Viking refrigerator, just way more earthy. You're handed a hunk of dark-dried fruitcake. Dense with barley apple slices, hazelnuts, and enough honey to make it last months. It's like trail mix in loaf form. These were travel essentials designed to survive time moisture and questionable boat rides. You help bury a clay pot of dried peas and herbs. Food preservation wasn't always high-tech, it was clever. Cool storage airtight clay vessels, hanging racks, and smoke-filled huts all work together to fight spoilage. There's even fermented food. A pot of fermented cabbage sloshes ominously. Good for the gut, someone says. You brace yourself and take a bite. It's like a crunchy vinegar cloud. Your gut might be thankful later. Your taste buds. Not so much. Then you hear about a legendary and controversial delicacy, fermented fish buried in the ground. Picture this fresh fish packed in a pit with herbs and left to rot. The result, a pungent, jelly-like food rich in flavor nutrients and odor. Historians still argue if this was widespread or just a fringe practice. A man offers you a spoonful from a sealed jar. You lean back instinctively. The smell hits before the taste, like salty, pickled thunder. You try it. Against all odds, it's not awful. Strong, yes. But once your senses stop screaming, there's a weird depth to it. Preservation also included fruit. Apples, when available, were sliced and sun-dried or smoked. Berries were mashed into paste with honey and dried into flat cakes. You're handed a leather pouch of these portable Viking fruit roll-ups. Sweet, tart, sticky. You chew happily. You notice that much of this work happens together. Families and neighbors sharing tasks, trading goods, watching the fire tending the hanging meats. It's more than food. It's ritual, community, insurance against hard times. As night creeps in, the smokehouse glows like a quiet temple. Flames flicker under the racks. Someone stirs a pot of smoked barley stew. Another ladle of that earthy, smoky tea appears in your hands. You sip, leaning against the wall, soaked in scent and soot and sleepy satisfaction. You now understand Viking preservation wasn't about fancy techniques. It was stubbornness and patience, fire and instinct. It meant knowing your land, your seasons, your odds, and working just a little harder to make sure tomorrow had a meal in it. Your eyes close slowly. The smoke curls around you like a blanket. You drift off to dreams of hanging cod and cheese barrels of wind-dried fish and sweet berry cakes. 1,000 tiny survival tricks, quiet, ancient, and enduring. You wake up to the rhythmic clang of something metal. No, not swords this time. Just a ladle knocking against a bronze pot. You stretch blink into the morning mist and follow the smell of something. Tangy. Sour, yet warm. Your nose is right. Today's menu is all about fermentation. Fermented foods may not get the spotlight in flashy Viking sagas, but they were a low-key superpower. Preservation flavor and gut health rolled into one weird, bubbling miracle. And, boy, did the Vikings embrace it. You're handed a bowl of what looks like porridge but thinner, runnier, and flecked with something green. You take a hesitant sip. It's tangy, earthy, and somehow fizzy. Soured barley broth, someone explains. A mix of grains left to ferment for days, even weeks. Turns out when water's questionable and refrigeration's not a thing, fermentation is your best friend. The taste grows on you. It's like your mouth went hiking through a damp forest and found enlightenment. Sour grain porridge wasn't just an occasional experiment, it was a staple. When the bread was old, or the barley didn't cook quite right, it fermented. Sometimes on purpose. Sometimes because someone forgot about the pot. You follow an older woman into a corner hut, cool-shaded, and filled with the bubbling gurgle of clay crocks. She lifts one and offers you a whiff. Whew. That'll wake you faster than Viking espresso. Inside cabbage. Sliced, salted, weighted down. You know this one sauerkraut's ancient cousin. It was known in various forms across many northern cultures. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly embraced fermented cabbage or whether it came later through continental trade. But evidence shows that some form of vegetable fermentation definitely existed. You try a pinch from the pot. It's crisp, sour, crunchy. Not bad for something that looks like a swamp project. And it's packed with vitamins key during long winters when fresh greens were a fantasy. Then there's the yogurt. You didn't expect dairy to bubble at you, but here we are. Cow or goat milk left to sit and sour often in animal stomachs used as fermentation vessels. Nature's own thermos. You sip from a wooden bowl and taste something thick, creamy, and faintly sharp. Viking kefir, basically. Tangier than modern yogurt, and definitely alive. They call it surmjölk, sour milk, used in cooking drinking, and probably even for bartering considering its versatility. It adds zing to sauces and heft to porridges. And yes, it goes great with honey and dried berries. You quickly learn to love it. A group of kids gathers around a large vat. They're stomping on something like grapes, but smaller, darker, and much more wild. Berries, elderberries, rowan berries, even some early juniper. This isn't just juice, it's fermentation in action. Wild berry wine. Not the sweet stuff you might expect, but a sharp, rustic brew that hits like a thunderclap. You're offered a sip. Your eyes water. Acquired taste, someone laughs. Indeed. Vikings made mead, too. Honey fermented with water, sometimes herbs or fruit tossed in. It was more than just booze. It was ceremonial, medicinal, and incredibly caloric. Good for energy. Great for celebration. Mead was sacred, associated with the gods and poetry and magic. You feel slightly more eloquent after a sip, but that might just be the alcohol. And speaking of honey-fermented honey cakes were a thing. Left to rest in cool storage, they developed this unique tang. You bite into one and taste something between sourdough and cookie. Not bad. Definitely chewy. Possibly a little alive. Later, you help bury a crock. It's filled with mashed root vegetables and wild garlic set to ferment over weeks. This was one Viking way of surviving winter without everything turning bland and gray. Even tubers, if treated right, could become tangy delights. Fermentation wasn't always precise. Wild yeasts floated freely in the air. A good batch could depend on weather storage or plain luck. Some families passed down crocks with years of friendly microbes. Others, not so lucky. One man tells you about a failed turnip batch that fought back. You nod solemnly. You've met bad leftovers before. Historians still debate how sophisticated Viking fermentation really was. Did they understand the microbial science? Likely not, but did they develop intuition and passed down techniques? Absolutely. From one generation to the next, they learned when to stir, when to seal, and when to run away from a stinky jar. You're shown a fermented fish paste, strong salty made from anchovy-like fish packed in herbs. You try it cautiously. The taste slaps your tongue, does a little jig, and leaves you wondering if you like it. You decide you do. Eventually, there's even fermented grains turned into a kind of Viking kvass, thin, sour, drinkable barley, maybe flavored with herbs or honey. Less punch than beer, but more character than water. Hydration with attitude. You take a wooden cup and sip slowly. Your stomach gives a contented rumble. You can't help but notice the communal rhythm of it all. Fermentation takes patience, sure, but also trust. You leave food to time to nature, to invisible helpers in the air. You wait. You stir. You sniff. You taste. You hope. It's like cooking meets alchemy meets roulette. In one corner, a woman shows you a clay stopper fitted perfectly to a jug. Airlock Viking style. A clever way to keep unwanted bugs out while gases escape. The simplicity is brilliant. This culture wasn't just surviving, it was innovating. Quietly, bubblily, you glance around at all the crockery sacks, dried herbs, and jars. It looks messy, but there's a method to it all. Even the kids know which jar is edible and which one is for compost. You back away from that one quickly. As twilight falls, you're handed a bowl of warm fermented milk sweetened with honey and sprinkled with dried apple. It's like pudding if pudding went to sea and came back wiser. You savor each spoonful, the tart edge mellowed by the fire's warmth. The meal finishes with a tiny toast, just a shot of berry mead. Everyone clinks cups and nods. It's not just about flavor. Fermentation brought people together. It was communal science passed down without labs, only memory and smell and instinct. And maybe that's the real magic. The Viking world could be harsh, cold, raw, dangerous. But here, in these jars and bowls and barrels, was comfort, predictability, survival through the slow power of change. You fall asleep to the sound of bubbles, faint gurgles, and the soft clink of crock lids. Fermentation never sleeps, and neither, it seems, do the microbes. They're always busy quietly transforming the world, one tangy jar at a time. You wake up to a strange sound, like someone tapping gently on a hollow log. But it's not percussion. It's the unmistakable thunk of someone grinding grain. A steady, circular scrape. You blink through the morning haze and follow the noise. It leads you to a low hut with a wide doorway and a floor littered with chaff. Today, you'll meet the Viking grain. Someone is hunched over a quernstone, a large round slab with a hole in the center and another smaller handheld stone above it. She pours barley into the middle and rotates the top with slow, practiced rhythm. Out comes a soft powder, speckled and warm. Flour, Viking style. Grains were the backbone of the Viking diet. While the sagas love to talk about feasting on roasted boar and heroic portions of mead, the truth is, you probably ate bread. A lot of it. And porridge. Sometimes both in the same meal. Grain was affordable, long-lasting, and easy to grow in northern climates. Barley, rye, and oats were your best friend's wheat when you could get it was for special occasions, or the wealthy. You pinch some flour between your fingers. It's coarse. No fine white bakery fluff here. The stone grinding leaves behind texture bits of husk bran, and even tiny pebbles if someone wasn't paying attention. Dental health. Not great. You feel your molars flinch in sympathy. Still, this grain was magic. You're handed a bowl of warm porridge, thick and earthy, sweetened with honey, and topped with a few dried berries. It tastes simple, filling, like something that keeps you standing through rainstorms and raids. You learn that porridge wasn't always sweet. It could be savory too, cooked with herbs, onions, even meat scraps. Add a bit of sour milk or broth and boom, Viking risotto. You try a version with mushrooms and a drizzle of smoke-cured fat. You'd order this at a fancy modern brunch. Bread came in many forms. Flatbreads baked on hot stones, ash cakes cooked right in the embers, or, if you were lucky and had a proper oven, round loaves crusted in soot and love. One man shows you a loaf with seeds pressed into the crust. Another cuts open a darker, dense slab. It's almost black and smells like molasses. Probably rye. Possibly magic. Historians still argue whether yeast-based bread was common among Vikings. Sourdough starters may have existed, passed down through generations of slightly sour-smelling cloth bundles. But most bread was likely unleavened or only mildly risen thanks to wild fermentation. You help knead a sticky lump of dough, then slap it onto a hot, flat stone near the hearth. In minutes, it puffs, gently cracks, forming along the edges. You tear off a piece and taste earthy smoky with a pleasant chew. It needs nothing more, though a smear of butter and some herbs wouldn't hurt. Some Vikings added birch bark flour to stretch grain stores. You try a sample. It's woody. Let's just say it builds character. They also used ground-up legumes or root vegetables when grain ran low. Bread was humble, adaptable, a quiet hero. You're shown a bundle of dried grain tied with twine. Barley mostly. The fields weren't vast modern farms, but smaller patches rotated seasonally and guarded against unpredictable weather. Harvesting meant sickles sweat and hoping the storms stayed away just one more week. Grain storage was an art. Pits dug into the earth, raised granaries, woven baskets. Mice were the eternal enemy. Mold, too. So grain was dried, carefully stored in cool, dark places and inspected often. One spoiled batch could mean a hungry winter. Oats were another favorite. You try a thin oat cake baked on a griddle with just a bit of salt. It's crispy, plain, and addictive. You add a dollop of sour cheese on top and suddenly you've invented Viking nachos. You're welcome. There's even a grain-based drink, more barley kvass, thin and slightly fizzy. This was hydration for everyone, kids included. Not strong enough to cause trouble, but safer than sometimes questionable water. Think of it as ancient Gatorade, just with more husk. You learn that some bread was cooked in communal ovens, shared spaces where families would bring their dough and bake in turns. It wasn't just practical, it was social. A time to share news swap ingredients and maybe show off your latest herb mix. Vikings also boiled whole grains into what was essentially grain stew mixed with vegetables, meat, or fish. One bubbling pot you pass smells like garlic leeks and barley. You try a spoonful. It's hearty, like edible armor. There's a sack of milled flour mixed with crushed nuts. The woman explains it's used for special feast bread, sweetened with dried apple and honey. You sample a slice. It's chewy dense and vaguely resembles fruit cake, but in a good way. Then there's the travel rations. You see flatbreads stacked and wrapped in cloth meant to last for weeks. Hard, dry, nearly unbreakable without moisture, but perfect for long trips across sea or snow. Just soak in broth, and you've got a meal. A boy hands you a burnt loaf with a grin. Mistakes happened. You bite into it anyway. It's crunchy, slightly bitter, and still edible. Waste not, want not. You nod approvingly. Burnt is the new gourmet. Another fringe tidbit, some evidence suggests that Vikings flavored bread with ground tree bark. Not just birch, but pine or elm. For fiber, maybe. For flavor, possibly. For survival, definitely. You gnaw a sample. It's like chewing history. And mulch. You learn that some communities even fermented leftover bread scraps into a thin gruel, like a yeasty soup, rehydrated and warmed. Not fancy, but efficient. And somehow comforting. There's even bread used in ritual. A dark rye loaf baked with herbs and carved with symbols, offered at a seasonal feast or buried for good harvest. You run your fingers over the designs. Bread wasn't just food. It was memory, belief, promise. By dusk, your hands are dusted with flour. Your stomach is pleasantly full. And you now understand grain wasn't filler. It was foundation. Every spoonful of porridge, every crusty heel, every oat cake was a piece of Viking resilience. As the coals dim, you lean back against the cool wall of the baking hut. Somewhere, someone flips another flatbread. Another grain finds its way into the future. And your dreams are full of barley fields, wooden bowls, and the warm, steady scrape of stone against stone. You drift awake to a soft splash. The scent hits you before your eyes are even open salt brine and a faint tang of seaweed. You're near the shoreline again, and today, it's fish day. Vikings were no strangers to the sea, and fish wasn't just something they ate when meat ran out. For many, especially those living near coasts and fjords, fish was the primary protein. In fact, you'll eat more fish today than you ever intended, and in more forms than you knew existed. You start with dried cod. A thick slab of it is past your waist stiff and pale like someone taxidermied dinner. You knock on it. It clacks. Yep, edible driftwood. But don't be fooled, this is stockfish, and it's gold. Cod hung out to dry in the cold, windy air for months. No salt needed, just wind patience and the occasional hungry raven to chase off. You try to gnaw a corner, then someone laughs and hands you a mallet. Stockfish needs to be beaten until soft, so you give it a good whack. And another. By the third hit, it starts to resemble food. Once shredded and rehydrated in broth, it's chewy salty and surprisingly satisfying. Fish like herring mackerel and eel were salted and stored in barrels. Salt was valuable, sometimes imported, sometimes scraped from evaporated sea pools. You sample pickled herring slick with oil and herbs. It's sharp oily, and your mouth puckers involuntarily. Good for winter, someone nods. You believe them. It tastes like survival. You're invited to help gut and clean a fresh catch. The knife work is precise, fast, and practiced. No waste. The heads go to stew, the bones to broth, the skins, maybe a future pair of shoes. Nothing's tossed without purpose. Over a firefish is skewered whole eyes, fins, all. You're handed a charred one crackling and spitting over the flame. You peel back the skin, revealing tender white flesh inside. No lemon, no butter. Just a sprinkle of salt and a squeeze of wild sorrel juice. You take a bite. It's smoky rich and tastes like the ocean had a barbecue. In a large pot, someone's boiling fish with onions, leeks, and a handful of barley. Fish soup, Viking style. You sip the broth and it's oddly soothing. Gentle, herbal, and clean. It warms your chest, then your bones, then your soul. If you ever get shipwrecked, you hope this soup shows up. Then comes the more daring stuff. A woman proudly presents a wooden trough filled with fermented fish paste. This is no modern pâté. This is something older, funkier, and definitely alive. You try a smear on barley flatbread. It's pungent, salty, sour, and lingers like an awkward goodbye. But once your taste buds stop panicking, it's kinda great. Historians still argue whether this kind of extreme fermentation was widespread, or if it developed more in later periods. Some claim early Vikings used milder preservation. Others say, judging by old fish pits, they absolutely leaned into the funk. You see fish strung up over smoke hanging like silvery icicles. Cold smoked for days, even weeks, until firm and ready to last a season. You grab a sliver and chew. It's dense, intense. A snack for warriors and travelers alike. Easy to carry. Impossible to forget. There's even fish blood sausage made from leftovers, barley, and herbs. You try a slice. It's hearty, earthy, and surprisingly mellow. Almost comforting. Another person hands you tiny fried fish bones, and all. Crunchy snacks, they say. You pop one in your mouth, and it's like eating salty fish chips. Not bad. You learn that dried seaweed sometimes found its way into stews, adding iodine saltiness and variety. You chew a strip. It's briny and rubbery, but in a good way. a kind of Viking umami. Fishing methods varied. Nets, handlines, fish traps, spears in the shallows. Men, women, and even kids participated. One clever trick using fish guts as bait in a hollowed-out log trap. You watch a boy haul in a wriggling catch proud as any warrior. Then there's inland fish. Pike perch trout caught in lakes and rivers. A smaller scale, but still essential. You sample a freshwater stew, milder, slightly sweet, and filled with root vegetables. It's a cozy lakeside lunch. Fish bones were saved. Crushed into meal boiled for broth, sometimes used as field fertilizer. Even the eyes could be boiled and eaten. You're offered one. You politely decline. Everyone laughs. Wise choice. And let's not forget roe fish eggs, often salted or smoked. A delicacy for some. You try a spoonful. It pops like tiny fireworks. Salty, creamy, vaguely alien. Would go great on toast. You ask if there's ever a break from seafood, and someone hands you a fish pie. Yes, really. Baked in a simple barley crust stuffed with chopped smoked fish leeks and wild herbs. It's rustic, flaky, and oddly modern. You finish the whole thing. One man tells you of a giant feast where fish was shaped into animal forms. Eels coiled like serpents, trout layered like dragon scales. Viking food art. Historians debate whether this was common or just for nobles. You hope it was real. Who doesn't want a fish shaped like a wolf? Night falls. A last fire crackles. Over it, someone places fish skins wrapped around a stick like Viking fish jerky. It crisps up, crackles, and you break off a piece. It's crunchy, smoky, and strangely addictive. Your belly is full of fish in every imaginable form. Smoked, dried, boiled, fried, souped, and smeared. But it doesn't feel repetitive. Each method adds a layer, a purpose, a flavor. Vikings respected the sea not just for its power, but for the food it gave. Fish kept communities alive through dark winters and rough voyages. It was tradition, economy, and sustenance all wrapped in scales and salt. You close your eyes as waves lap gently nearby. The wind smells of brine and firewood. Somewhere, someone is still gutting the evening's catch, preparing for tomorrow. The sea never sleeps, and neither, it seems, does dinner. A gentle gray mist coils through the trees as you rub the sleep from your eyes one final time. Morning has arrived again in the Viking world, but this one feels slower, softer. The fires are lower, the chatter muted. Something about today feels like the end of a long feast. You wander toward the center of the village where a group of people are gathered around an odd setup. A large wooden bucket, a few clay jars, and something that smells unmistakably like goat. Today, you're diving into the world of Viking dairy. You're handed a small wooden cup. Inside, something pale creamy and faintly sour sloshes gently. You take a sip. It's not milk, not exactly. It's skyr, a thick, tangy dairy product somewhere between yogurt and cheese. High in protein, low in fat, and still a breakfast favorite in modern Iceland. Skyr isn't new, it's old. Very old. Vikings made it with rennet and patience, letting it thicken naturally before straining the whey. The result, a spoonable nutritious food that didn't spoil as fast as regular milk. You scoop some up with your finger. Tart, smooth, and surprisingly filling. Add a drizzle of honey or handful of crushed berries and it becomes a kind of dessert. But dairy didn't stop there. Milk from cows, goats, and sheep was central to Viking foodways, especially in the summer months when animals were full and grazing was good. You learn quickly that fresh milk was tricky. Without refrigeration, it spoiled fast. So they drank it warm, soured it into buttermilk, or churned it into butter. You're invited to help with churning. It's not glamorous, it's arm-burning. A wooden dasher slams up and down inside a barrel as you try not to wince. After what feels like an eternity of sloshing, someone finally announces butter. The top is scraped-shaped and pressed into rough little rounds. You spread a dab on barley bread. It's creamy grassy and possibly the best thing you've tasted in days. You're shown how sour milk was treasured, not wasted. Used in stews, baked into bread, or drunk directly. You brace yourself and sip. It's tangy. Like milk with a personality. Not your favorite, but certainly memorable. One woman lets you try a Viking cheese. Hard, crumbly, and sharp. Made in summer, aged into the colder months. Sometimes smoked. Sometimes stored in wax or ash. You chew a piece and get a nutty, salty hit. It's like biting history. Historians still argue whether Viking dairy was universally popular or more regionally specific. Evidence from different sites shows wide variance, some areas leaning heavily on cow milk, others preferring goat or sheep. You shrug. All of it tastes like effort. Then there's the oddities. A strange round of cheese flavored with caraway and smoked in a turf hut. A sweet curd pressed into wooden molds with patterns carved on top. Ritual cheeses, maybe. Or just well-loved snacks. You try a slice. It tastes like celebration. In the corners of dairying, you find quirks, cheese rinds used as poultices, whey saved for cleaning even fermented milk buried in the earth. One bowl is so old and sour it fizzes slightly. You take a cautious sniff, then pretend to sip. Someone smirks. You're learning. Dairy was deeply seasonal. Spring and summer meant milk. Winter, not so much. Animals needed energy to stay warm, so preserving milk mattered, turning it into things that could last. Cheese, butter, skyr. You start to see how each form was not just food, but a method of survival. You help clean out the cheese molds, wash a few wooden buckets. Everything smells like hay smoke and sourness. But beneath it all, there's care. Tradition. A rhythm passed down hand to hand, churn to churn. A young girl hands you a sliver of something sweet. A cheese ball rolled in honey and herbs. You bite in and nearly hum with delight. It's like Viking cheesecake. You ask if there's more. She shakes her head, grinning. Back at the hearth, a pot of warm milk simmers. Someone's making a custard-like pudding. Milk egg, maybe a touch of honey. You dip your spoon and savor the gentle richness. This isn't warrior food, it's comfort food. The kind of thing someone's grandmother invents. Even the animals get their moment. You're introduced to the goats. Scrappy, loud, and unbothered. They nuzzle your hand and attempt to eat your sleeve. Their milk was smaller in volume, but richer. You imagine carrying buckets back from the pasture, dodging hooves and storms. You'd earn that butter, and for the fringe lovers, yes, there's evidence of Viking folk mixing milk with blood. A grim cocktail used sparingly, perhaps ritually, or for nourishment during lean times. You opt out. No shame. Your ancestors would understand. Finally, you see a communal butter feast. bowls passed around bread dipped straight in, everyone licking fingers and laughing. It's messy, joyful, a celebration of fat and flavor. You feel your stomach warm from the inside. Dairy might not be glamorous, but it was glue. It bound people's seasons and survival together. From fresh milk to fermented skyr, every form had its place. The village winds down as the sun lowers. The air smells of pasture and hearth smoke. A last round of cheese is wrapped in cloth and tucked away for winter. Someone hums an old song while cleaning the churn, and you, full of milk bread and a hint of sea breeze, finally sit. Not to eat, just to rest. To remember the flavors that carried a people through storms, hunger, and time itself. Now the fires are little more than glowing coals, and the laughter has softened into quiet murmurs. The Viking world around you slows. The air cools. You can almost hear the stretch of twilight settling over mossy rooftops and silent fjords. You pull a thick woolen blanket around your shoulders and lean against the wooden wall of the longhouse. Someone nearby hums a lullaby, low, wordless, ancient. It's not for you, but you listen anyway. It feels like it belongs. Outside, the sea murmurs like a sleeping animal. Inside, the smell of dried herbs and warm milk still clings gently in the air. Your eyes grow heavy, and even the memory of stockfish doesn't seem quite so sharp anymore. Everything's slowing now. The echo of grinding stones, the soft slap of dough on fire-heated stone, the ripple of honey into hot porridge. It all lingers like the last warmth in a cup. This journey through Viking kitchens has been long-winding and deliciously odd. From stews thick with barley to bread dotted with pine flour, you've eaten your way through the past with an open mind and a full heart. So now sink into that softness. Let your breath slow. Your limbs relax. There's no more fish to clean, no porridge to stir, no sour milk to sip. Just the hush of the north wind brushing over old stones and the distant cry of a seabird calling from another time. You're safe. You're full. You're home for now. Sweet dreams, explorer. End of script. Sweet dreams.